I did a lot of camping when I was a teenager growing up in far north Queensland, Australia. A few of my mates and I used to go pig hunting on huge cattle stations out on the tablelands. The farmers would pay us to get rid of some of the feral pigs and kangaroos that were damaging their crops. It was a good way for a bunch of teenagers to make some cash and have an adventure. This particular trip happened during a school holiday. It was me and 3 of my friends. We had been out on this massive farm for 3 days already and had 2 more to go. We had been pretty successful and were all in good spirits, enjoying the freedom of being out in the bush on our own. To give you an idea of the scale of this place, you could drive an off-road vehicle for over 3 hours and still be on the same property. It was incredibly remote. When you were deep inside it, you did not feel like you were on a farm. You felt like you were in the middle of nowhere. The farmer had told us before we left that we were the only people camping on his land that week, and he warned us to be careful of any strangers we might come across because they should not be there. On our second to last night, we set up our camp in a nice little spot near a river. It was a flat, sandy area, surrounded by a lot of trees, perfect place for a campsite. We got a good fire going, cooked some dinner, and settled in for the night. We had the radio from our car playing some random music from a station we could barely pick up. We were just sitting around the fire, talking nonsense and having a few drinks. As it got close to midnight, we turned off the radio and the woods went quiet. We were just talking quietly among ourselves about having to go back to school soon. And that is when we heard it. We heard voices. They were beautiful female voices, singing softly in the distance. The sound seemed to drift in and out on the wind. At first, I thought I was just imagining it, but then I looked at my friends, and they had all gone completely silent, their eyes wide. We all listened intently. The voices sounded like a group of women singing and laughing together. The sound was coming from the dark forest near our campsite. It was far enough away that we could not make out any words, but close enough that we could clearly hear the melody and the occasional burst of laughter. One of my friends, Liam, is of Aboriginal descent, and I swear to you, all the colour drained from his face. In the flickering firelight, his dark skin looked pale and grey. He looked absolutely terrified. I asked him what was wrong, and he told us, his voice low and serious, that whatever we do, we must not go looking for the source of those voices. He explained that in Aboriginal folklore, there are stories of spirits or beings that live in the bush. They are described as being very tall and slender, and they lure people, especially men, away from trails and campsites by singing and calling out to them. The stories say that people who follow the voices are never seen again. His elders had always warned him about it, but this was the first time he had ever actually heard them himself. He was convinced that this was what they were talking about. Beautiful, inviting voices that tempt you into the dark. Me and my other 2 friends were skeptical. We thought it was probably just some other people, maybe some girls, camping nearby and having a good time. We were teenage boys, so the thought of going to investigate was definitely on our minds. But Liam was dead serious. As we were debating what to do, the voices seemed to get closer. Liam immediately threw more wood on the fire, making it blaze up brighter. He told us not to speak to them or call out, and to just stay by the light of the fire. The atmosphere around our camp became incredibly tense. The voices continued for what felt like an eternity, maybe 30 or 40 minutes. They circled our campsite, always staying just out of sight in the darkness. At times, they were so close, maybe only 50 meters away, that I could have sworn I heard them whisper, "Come, join us." The sound was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they faded away and were gone. The next morning, the first thing we did was search the entire area around our camp. We were all experienced at tracking animals in the bush, and we knew what to look for. We searched for footprints, a campfire, any sign that other people had been in the area. We found nothing. There were no tracks, no broken branches, no evidence that anyone had been anywhere near our campsite. People leave traces, especially in a group, but there was absolutely nothing. It was as if the voices had come from ghosts. When we got back to the farmhouse at the end of our trip, We told the farmer about what we had heard. He just nodded his head knowingly. He told us that he hears those voices from time to time, even from his house. He said they come and go as they please. He also believed the Aboriginal legends. I will never forget the sound of those voices. I do not know what they were, but I am glad we listened to our friend and stayed by the fire. Every small town has its one big celebration, and in my hometown on the shore of Lake Michigan, it was the 4th of July. The entire town would descend upon the main beach for a massive festival. There were carnival rides that looked like they were assembled 5 minutes before opening. The smell of fried dough and grilled corn hanging thick in the humid summer air, and local bands playing off-key covers of classic rock songs. It culminated in a huge fireworks display over the lake at midnight. Thousands of people would be there, a loud, chaotic, but generally happy crowd. This was back in 2021, and I usually skipped the whole thing, preferring to watch the fireworks from my backyard. But that year, my cousin, Jessica, called and begged me to go. Her new boyfriend, Tyler, was in town, and she wanted it to be a special night for them. I wasn't Tyler's biggest fan. He had that slick, overly confident vibe that always set my teeth on edge. But Jess was crazy about him, so I agreed to go and to be their designated driver since I wasn't much of a drinker. The plan was for me to pick them up, then swing by and get our other friend Chloe, who lived in a small apartment complex right by the beach, just a 5-minute walk from the festival grounds. I picked up Jess and Tyler, enduring his non-stop chatter about his crypto investments on the way to Chloe's. We found her waiting on her second-floor balcony, watching the sunset paint the lake in hues of orange and purple. After a round of hugs and catching up, we hadn't seen Chloe since she started her new job. We all went inside for a few minutes. Chloe's mum offered us sodas, and we chatted in the living room. By the time we left, the sun had completely vanished, and the first pops of amateur fireworks could be heard in the distance. The walk to the beach was exactly as I remembered. The air was warm and buzzing with energy. We spent the first couple of hours on the rides. I watched from the ground as the three of them were flung around on something called the Scrambler, their screams mixing with the loud music. Afterwards, we bought food and found a spot on the sand to eat. For a while, I forgot about my dislike for Tyler and just enjoyed the feeling of being out with my friends on a summer night. It felt good, like a little slice of freedom. We danced for an hour near the main stage, laughing and singing along terribly to songs we all knew by heart. Around 11, we were all thirsty and out of cash, so we decided to walk back to Chloe's apartment for some water. The main festival area was bright and noisy, but as we walked away from the crowds, the path grew darker and quieter. The string lights ended, and the only illumination came from the distant glow of the festival and the moon overhead. There were fewer streetlights near Chloe's complex, and we were soon walking in a comfortable, deep darkness. That's when I started to feel it. It was that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the undeniable feeling of being watched. The quiet, which had been peaceful moments before, now felt heavy and threatening. I glanced around but saw nothing, just the dark shapes of trees and houses. Subconsciously, I moved from the outside of our group to walk between Chloe and Tyler, putting them between me and the darkness of the road. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself my ears were just ringing from the loud music and that the sudden silence was playing tricks on my mind. We ran into some people we knew from high school, and in the cheerful chaos of catching up, the uneasy feeling faded completely. We got back to Chloe's, drank a ton of water, and lounged on her couch, exhausted. The big fireworks show wasn't for another hour. Chloe asked if she could sleep over at my place, and a quick call to my parents confirmed it was fine. They adored Chloe. At about 1:45 we all headed out again to find a good spot on the beach. We had only walked about a block when Chloe stopped dead. She'd forgotten her prescription allergy pill, which she needed to take before bed, or she'd wake up a stuffy, miserable mess. Jess groaned in annoyance, but we all agreed it was better to go back now than have to make another trip later. As we turned around, I noticed Chloe seemed distant. She was usually a chatterbox, but she was completely silent, her eyes scanning the dark street around us. I'm the quiet observer in our group, and I pick up on things like that. I asked her if she was okay. She just nodded and said, "Of course." But her mind was clearly somewhere else. I figured she was just annoyed about the pills. After retrieving them, we headed out for the third time. This time, Jess suggested we walk on the other side of the street. "It's better lit over there," she said, pointing to a path that ran alongside a small playground where a few families with young kids were still out. It seemed like a good idea. As we were crossing the street, Jess, who was walking next to me, muttered under her breath, "Don't look behind you." My first thought was that there was some drunk guy doing something stupid, but then she spoke to the whole group, her voice low and urgent. "Walk faster." That old feeling of being watched came rushing back, 10 times stronger. We all picked up the pace without question. Jess has a certain tone she only uses when she's dead serious. A quiet command went around the group. Don't look back. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around, to face whatever was there. But I trusted Jess. Once we were across the road and under the relative safety of a streetlight, I asked her what was going on. "There are 2 guys in dark hoodies following us," she said, her voice tight. "I saw them earlier." "Earlier when?" I asked, confused. "When we went back for water. They were standing across the street from Chloe's building, just watching." A cold dread spread through my chest. My feeling of being watched hadn't been my imagination, and the fact that they had waited for us to come back out was terrifying. I couldn't resist. I risked a sideways glance out of the corner of my eye. My heart slammed against my ribs. She was right. 2 men, both tall and dressed in black hoodies with the hoods pulled up, were walking on the other side of the street, keeping pace with us. It was a warm, humid night. There was no reason to be wearing heavy hoodies. They also had bandanas pulled up over their noses and mouths, obscuring their faces entirely. This wasn't just creepy, it was predatory. Jess told us not to look again and urged us to walk even faster. We were a group of 4, but Chloe and Jess were small, and I, despite being tall, was no fighter. They must have seen us as easy targets. The path ahead curved away from the road and ran alongside a large patch of thick, unlit brushland. Going around it would mean walking on the dark road, closer to the men. Without a word, we all made the same decision. We were taking a shortcut through the bushes. It wasn't a long stretch, and it would lead us directly back towards the noise and crowds of the festival. We plunged into the brush, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. The sound of dry leaves and twigs crunching under our feet seemed deafening. About halfway through, we heard another sound, more crunching leaves, and the heavy, rapid thud of footsteps behind us. They were chasing us. We all broke into a dead sprint, not daring to look back. We didn't need to. The fact that they were bold enough to chase 4 people confirmed they were either armed or dangerously confident. Adrenaline surged through me, and all I could think about was getting to the light, to the crowd. We burst out of the brushland and into the open space of a park that bordered the festival grounds. We didn't stop running until we were on the edge of the massive crowd gathered on the sand. We slowed to a hurried walk, weaving through groups of people until we found a spot deep within the throng, plopping down between 2 large families. We were all panting, trying to catch our breath. I glanced back over my shoulder and saw them. The 2 men were standing at the edge of the park, just lurking in the shadows, watching. The moonlight glinted off something metallic in one of their hands. It looked like a knife. I felt sick to my stomach. The fireworks started a few minutes later, and the thunderous booms made me jump every time. We tried to enjoy the show, but the image of those men was burned into my mind. Our original plan to leave before the finale to beat the traffic was scrapped. We decided to stay with the crowd, to use it as a shield. When the show ended, we moved with the massive wave of people, heading towards the main parking lot where my dad was picking us up. I called him when we got there, and he said he was about 10 minutes away. We found a spot to wait on a concrete ledge, trying to stay near other people. After a few minutes of anxious silence, I started scanning the area. The parking lot was a chaotic mess of cars trying to leave. I looked across the road, towards the darker, less crowded section of the lot, and my blood ran cold. The two men were there, partially hidden behind a large oak tree. Even from that distance, I could feel them staring right at me. They knew I'd seen them. The one who had the knife discreetly held it up, just enough for me to see, then slowly drew his thumb across his own throat. I grabbed my friends and pulled them to a different spot, right under a bright parking lot lamp, directly next to a family loading their kids into a minivan. My dad's car pulled up a minute later. We scrambled inside, locked the doors, and didn't say a single word about what had happened the whole ride home. I just kept looking out the back window until the lights of the festival were long gone. Nothing ever came of it, but it changed something for me. That night, the feeling of safety I'd always had in my small town was shattered for good. I was stationed at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina for a few years. Part of our annual training involved going through the tear gas chamber, which was located in a remote training area deep in the woods. The whole experience is designed to be miserable. You go into a small hut, they fill it with gas, you take off your mask, and then you stumble out, your eyes burning and your nose running like a faucet. A couple of years ago, we were doing our yearly qualification. I went through the chamber, did what I had to do, and came out into the fresh air, completely miserable. My sinuses were totally clogged, so I walked over to the edge of the clearing, near a small wooden shed we use for storage, to blow my nose. As I looked up, wiping my eyes, I saw something on the ground that made me stop. It was a large, neat pile of something shiny, red and brown. Being a curious and somewhat desensitized Marine, I walked over to get a closer look. What I found was a perfectly arranged pile of animal entrails. It was all the internal organs of a fairly large animal, maybe a deer or a wild hog, just sitting there in the middle of a sandy patch of ground. The organs looked incredibly fresh, glistening in the sunlight. But the weirdest part was the complete lack of any other evidence. There was no blood spatter on the ground around the pile. There were no drag marks, no animal tracks leading to or from the spot, and no sign of a carcass anywhere. The area was mostly sand and soft dirt, so any kind of struggle or animal activity should have left obvious tracks. It was as if a huge pile of fresh guts had just been dropped from the sky. It was clean, precise, and made absolutely no sense. I called a few of the other guys over to look at it, and everyone was just as baffled as I was. We stood there for a few minutes, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but we could not. It was just a deeply weird and unsettling sight in the middle of the woods. About a week or two later, my platoon went back out to the same training area for a week-long field exercise. It was standard infantry stuff, patrols, setting up defensive positions, and spending a lot of time being tired and dirty in the woods. On the first night, my squad was tasked with a long reconnaissance patrol. I was the point man, leading the way through the thick North Carolina woods in the dark. We were moving slowly and quietly, using our night vision goggles. Not even 20 minutes into the patrol, as I was navigating through a dense patch of undergrowth, the ground beneath me suddenly gave way. I dropped like a stone, weighed down by all my gear. I landed hard at the bottom of a deep hole, feeling a bunch of dry branches and what felt like bugs crawling on me. Falling into an old foxhole is pretty common out there, so I was not too concerned, just annoyed. Two of my squad mates came over to help pull me out. As they were helping me up, the fourth guy in our fire team shone his flashlight down into the hole to see what I'd fallen into. That is when everyone started screaming and hitting me. The beam of the flashlight illuminated a writhing mass of spiders. The foxhole I had fallen into was a massive nest for brown recluse spiders. There were thousands of them, and I was covered in them. The bugs I had felt crawling on me were not just any bugs. I have never moved so fast in my life. I ripped off my jacket and my shirt, frantically smacking and brushing the spiders off me. After the initial panic subsided, and I was sure I was spider-free, the guy with the flashlight looked back into the hole. "Holy hell," he said, his voice quiet with shock. The light revealed that the bottom of the entire foxhole was not just filled with spiders, it was also filled with bones. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of small animal bones, all picked clean, lying at the bottom of the pit. It was a spider-infested mass grave. I got a few nasty bites that swelled up pretty badly, but I was lucky it was not worse. I could not help but think about that neat pile of guts we had found just a short distance away from this spider pit. It was probably just a strange coincidence, but the image of those two things, the clean pile of organs and the spider-filled pit of bones, has stuck with me as one of the creepiest and most unexplained things I have ever seen. This whole thing started back in 2012, when I was in my first year of high school. Facebook was at its absolute peak, and everyone I knew was obsessed with it. My friends and I were on it constantly, posting statuses, sharing photos, and adding anyone and everyone. One day, I got a friend request from a very strange account. The profile picture was a blurry, distorted image of a cartoon character that looked like it had been taken from the first page of a Google image search. The profile itself was almost completely blank. There were no personal details, just a few crude, unfunny jokes posted as statuses. The weird thing was, this account had over 500 friends, including a lot of people from my school that I knew. I did not think much of it. Back then, I accepted every friend request I got, so I clicked confirm and completely forgot about it. About a week later, I got a message from this account. It just said, "Hi." I probably replied with something generic like "Hey" or "Who is this?" But I never got a response. I forgot about it again until I received another message a few days later. This time it said, "How was bowling?" My friends and I had gone bowling the night before, and I had posted a picture of us there on my Facebook page. It was a little weird, but it was explainable. Anyone who was my friend on Facebook could have seen that picture. After that, all of my close friends started getting friend requests from the same account, and most of them accepted, thinking it was just some kind of joke account from our school. The messages to me became more frequent. They were always creepy, but always based on information that was publicly available on my profile. If I posted a new picture of myself, I would get a message saying, "I like your shirt." I just laughed it off with my friends. We all thought it was just someone from our school playing a prank on us. Then, the messages started to change. They became more personal and unsettling. I would get a message like, "When's your mum back?" just after my mum had left the house. Or, "What did you get from the shop?" a few minutes after I'd walked home from the local convenience store. I started to get paranoid, thinking it was one of my neighbors watching me from their window. But then I talked to my friends, and they told me they were getting similar messages and that they were getting worse too. My messages escalated significantly. I started receiving photos of my parents' car parked outside of restaurants they had gone to. I got a close-up photo of the house number on my front door. My friends were getting things like screenshots of their family members' profiles or Google Earth images of their houses with a circle drawn around them. But what was happening to me felt much more direct and invasive. The creepiest thing I received was a photo of me standing outside my school, talking to my friends. The photo was clearly taken from the driver's seat of a parked car across the street, because you could see the reflection of the dashboard in the window. Around this time, I got a new phone for my birthday. On the very first day I had it, I started getting text messages from a strange 5-digit number. The messages said things like "guess who" and "nice new phone." I realized they were using one of those old websites that let you send anonymous texts for free. The texts continued for weeks, until I finally told my mum I was getting prank calls and she got me a new SIM card with a new number. The anonymous texts stopped for a while. This is when things got much weirder. I started hanging out with a guy named Kyle, who I knew from school. We started taking the train into the city on weekends and just exploring. We ended up meeting a group of people our age who hung out in a park near a big shopping centre. I really connected with a girl in that group named Sarah. We would talk for hours, and I quickly developed a crush on her. I asked her to add me on Facebook. As she was searching for my name on her phone, her face suddenly went pale. She showed me her screen. The only mutual friend we had was the creepy fake account She told me that she and her friends had been getting really weird messages from that account for the past few weeks, right around the time I had started hanging out with their group. For a minute, she was convinced it was me, and she started to get angry. But then Kyle and I showed her all the messages we had been receiving, and she realized we were all being targeted by the same person. In a weird way, the shared experience brought us closer. We would text each other whenever we got a new creepy message. We eventually went on a date. We went out to dinner, and then for a walk in a park on the edge of the city. Afterward, we went back to my house to hang out. We lost track of time, and by the time we realized it, it was almost 11 at night. My mum did not want her walking to the train station alone that late, so she offered to drive her home. We all got in the car, and on the way to the city, we had to go through a long toll tunnel. As we entered the tunnel, my mum mentioned that she thought the car behind us had been following us for the past couple of miles. It freaked me out, but I did not say anything. We lost the car in the tunnel and dropped Sarah off safely at her house. On the way back, we stopped at a McDonald's right near the tunnel entrance for my mum to get a coffee. As we were pulling out of the parking lot, I saw the car again. I was 100% sure it was the same one. It followed us all the way back to my neighborhood and then turned down a different street right before we got to my house. The next day, I woke up to a flood of messages from the Facebook account. They were vile and aggressive. Things like, "Hope you had a good time," and "You shouldn't be with her." I did not reply to any of them, and I did not tell Sarah because I did not want to scare her. Eventually, this person got my new phone number and started texting me daily again. They would detail exactly where I was, who I was with, and what I was wearing. I made sure my phone's location services were always off, and I was not posting anything on social media that could give away my location. By this point, most of my friends had stopped receiving messages. It was just me, Sarah, and Kyle. Sarah and I dated for a few months. When we made it Facebook official, the messages got even worse. I also started getting letters in the mail addressed to me. They were always just a blank piece of paper, or a page filled with meaningless scribbles. After a few more months, Sarah and I broke up but stayed friends. Then, almost a full year after the first message, everything just stopped. The texts, the messages, the letters, all of it. The Facebook account was deleted about a month later. To this day, I have no idea who it was. Years later, when we were both in college, I ran into Sarah on New Year's Eve. She told me that a few months prior, she and her roommate had been dealing with a stalker. A guy had been calling them, banging on their door in the middle of the night. They called the police, and he was arrested. She said she never got a good look at him, but the things he would say on the phone were disturbingly similar to the messages our stalker used to send. I will probably never know for sure if it was the same guy, but the thought that someone watched me so closely for an entire year is something that will never leave me. The whole thing went down about 2 years ago, right after Christmas in 2022. I was 19 and had just dropped out of community college after a semester because I realized studying business administration felt like a death sentence. I had no job, no plans, and a ton of free time, which was driving my parents crazy. I spent most of my days playing online games or hitting the heavy bag in our garage, which were the only two things I was any good at. My mum, who still gets all her news from printed flyers and local TV, found an ad for a casting agency on a bulletin board at the grocery store. Without asking me, she called the number and scheduled an appointment. She presented it to me like she'd solved all my problems. I was annoyed, but also desperate for something to do, so I agreed to go. The idea of being in a commercial or something sounded cool, and honestly, I was a pretty lean guy back then, so I figured they might want me for some kind of clothing ad. I was completely clueless about how that world actually worked, and my ignorance was about to get me into serious trouble. The address they gave me led to a part of the city I had never been to, an old industrial zone that time had forgotten. I had to take 2 different buses to get there. The building was a total wreck. It was a huge, blocky brick structure that looked like it used to be a factory or a warehouse. Most of the windows were boarded up, and the ones that weren't were shattered. Dark green ivy crawled up the cracked brick walls, and weeds were reclaiming the parking lot. The whole area was eerily quiet, with no cars or people anywhere. It felt like a ghost town. I walked around the entire building looking for an entrance, but there was no main door, just graffiti-covered walls and piles of trash. Finally, at the back, I found a set of concrete stairs leading down below ground level to a single battered wooden door. It was dark, rotted, and had no knob or handle. I had no idea if I was supposed to push it or pull it. For a moment, I was convinced I was in the wrong place. This couldn't be a professional business. I pulled out my phone and called the number my mum had written down. A woman answered, her voice so low and gravelly I thought it was a man at first. She introduced herself as Helena and was surprisingly calm and reassuring. She confirmed that this was the right place and explained how to open the door. She told me to push it inward just a little bit, then slowly pull it toward me because the hinges were fragile. She also warned me that it would be completely dark inside because a transformer had blown in the area and they had no electricity. She said I needed to walk straight ahead through the first dark room until I felt a second door. That door would lead to a lit hallway and their main office. My mind was screaming at me that this was a terrible idea. Every horror movie I had ever seen started exactly like this. But Helena had an explanation for everything. She said the building was an old textile mill from the 1950s that was heavily damaged in a flood back in the 90s and had been abandoned ever since. Her company was a small startup with almost no budget, so they rented the basement for next to nothing. It sounded plausible enough, especially since the rent in this city was insane. But then she asked something that sent a shiver down my spine. She said, in a casual tone, "You're all by yourself out there, right?" It was a weird question, as if she was checking to make sure I was alone. Still, I pushed my paranoia down. I was desperate for something to happen in my life. I ended the call and did what she said. I nudged the door, then pulled it open. The smell of damp earth and decay hit me immediately. Just inside the doorway, a rickety wooden chair was propped against the wall, probably to keep the door from swinging shut. I stepped inside and pulled my phone out, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the pitch blackness, revealing an empty, dusty concrete room. In one corner, there were a few more stacked chairs, and next to them, a large, dirty canvas tarp was spread out on the floor. It had some dark, ugly stains on it. The second door was directly in front of me, looking just as rotted as the first one. I couldn't believe they wouldn't at least fix up the door to their office. I gently pushed it, and it swung open with a loud, groaning creak. The room beyond was just as dark as the first. The woman had lied. There was no lit hallway. I was starting to get really angry now. This was unprofessional and dangerous. I stood there in the darkness, with my phone light on, trying to figure out what to do. The whole situation felt wrong, but I had this stupid pride that made me not want to admit I was scared. I had been in dark places before. Our old house had a shed in the backyard with no electricity, and I used to go in there at night all the time. This was just a stupid, cheap office. Annoyed, I decided to call the number again to complain. I turned off my flashlight to save the battery and raised the phone to my ear. The second the light from my screen went out, I heard a loud slam behind me. It was the sound of that first rotten door swinging shut. I spun around with a yell, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with my phone, trying to turn the flashlight back on, but the dim light from the dialing screen was useless against the suffocating darkness. I shouted, "Hello!" into the void, but only silence answered. Then, my call connected. I heard the ringing tone in my ear, but at the same time, I heard another phone ringing from inside the room with me. It was that classic, old Nokia ringtone, the piano one. It was coming from the direction of the door that had just slammed shut. The ringing stopped. I have never been so terrified in my entire life. I dropped into a crouch, pressing my back against the cold concrete wall. I started to shuffle sideways, moving as quietly as I could. I could hear faint, shuffling footsteps from the other side of the room, but I couldn't tell if they were coming closer. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I knew where the door was, and the person seemed to be moving without a clear direction. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a couple of quarters. I took a deep breath and threw them as hard as I could into the opposite corner of the room. The moment they clattered against the floor, I bolted for the door. I ran blindly in the dark, my hands outstretched. I slammed into the door, pushing with all my might. I expected it to open, but something was blocking it. The chair, the one that was inside the first room. I stumbled back, falling to the ground. Behind me, I heard heavy, frantic footsteps and a low, angry grunt. I scrambled to my feet and ran again, this time with no plan, just pure terror. I just needed to get to the other door, the one leading outside. My shin crashed into another chair in the dark, sending a shock of pain up my leg, but the momentum threw me forward. I hit the main door with my shoulder so hard that the rotted wood splintered and the whole thing flew off its hinges. I tumbled out onto the damp ground outside. The grey afternoon light was blinding. My first instinct was to scream for help, and I did, at the top of my lungs. I looked back into the dark doorway and saw him. He was a huge man, probably over 300 pounds, wearing a dirty white tank top and sweatpants. He was holding a piece of cloth in one hand, and his face was twisted in pure rage. I scrambled backwards, got up, and ran up the concrete stairs faster than I ever thought I could move. I didn't look back. I just ran straight toward the main road, back towards civilization. I sprinted for what felt like an eternity, my lungs burning, until I finally saw the familiar sight of cars and streetlights. I flagged down the first taxi I saw and collapsed into the back seat, telling the driver to just go. Halfway home, I called my mom and told her everything. She started sobbing, blaming herself for putting me in danger. That night, we went to the police station and filed a report. A few days later, they told us what they found in that basement. There was a rag soaked in chloroform, a roll of duct tape, and a set of zip ties on the floor. They also found a smashed old Nokia phone in the weeds outside. That experience messed me up for a long time. I still get a wave of anxiety whenever I have to go to a job interview. I only feel comfortable if it's in a busy public place during the day. One man, one stupid ad, and one bad decision almost ended everything. It was, without a doubt, the worst holiday season of my life. When I was 16, my idea of a summer job was not flipping burgers or lifeguarding. I managed to get a position with a trail maintenance crew in a national park in Colorado. It was hard work, clearing brush, digging water bars, and hauling rocks, but I loved being outdoors. Our crew was a small, mismatched group of college kids and a couple of old-timers, led by a cynical, leather-faced man named Gus, who had been working in those mountains for 30 years. One sweltering afternoon, we were working on a remote, seldom-used trail miles from any road. I told Gus I needed to wander off for a bit to find a private spot for a bathroom break. He just grunted and waved me away. As I walked off the main trail into the thick pine forest, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was a cloying, sickly sweet odor mixed with the foul stench of decay. We often came across dead animals, deer, elk, so at first I just assumed that was it. But the further I walked, the more powerful and overwhelming the smell became. It made my nose burn and my stomach churn. I found a large ponderosa pine to do my business behind and noticed a small pile of trash at its base. This was unusual. We were deep in the backcountry where you rarely saw any litter. It wasn't just random trash either. It was a neat pile of candy wrappers, dozens of them, all the same brand, and a single dirt-stained teddy bear with one of its button eyes missing. It looked like a small, sad offering. My eyes were drawn to the tree itself. Carved into the rough bark, just above the pile of trash, were 2 words. The carving was fresh, the wood beneath still pale. It said, "I'm here." Next to the words was a crudely carved arrow, pointing deeper into a dense, almost impassable thicket of thorny bushes. The smell was coming from that thicket. It was rolling out in waves, so thick I could almost taste it. My mind started to race, conjuring all sorts of horrifying images of what could be in there, what could be the source of that smell, and the reason for the strange shrine at the base of the tree. A part of me, a morbid, stupidly curious part, wanted to push through the thorns and see. But my survival instinct, screaming at the top of its lungs, held me back. I stood there, frozen, caught in a debate between curiosity and terror. I was imagining a suicide victim's body, or worse, something a budding serial killer had left behind. That's when I heard it. A single, sharp crack, the sound of a heavy branch snapping under weight. It came from deep within the thicket, exactly where the arrow was pointing. That was all it took. I didn't wait to see what made the sound. I bolted. I ran back towards the main trail, not caring about the noise I was making, my heart hammering in my chest. I burst back into the clearing where the rest of the crew was working, panting and wild-eyed. Gus looked up from his work, his expression annoyed. "See a bear?" he asked dryly. I tried to explain what I had found, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush. I told him about the smell, the trash, the teddy bear, the carving on the tree, and the sound I heard from the thicket. He listened with his usual cynical expression, but as I spoke, I saw something in his eyes change. The cynical mask dropped, replaced by a look of genuine concern. He didn't question me. He didn't make a sarcastic comment. He just pulled out his satellite phone, a piece of equipment reserved for absolute emergencies, and called the park's main ranger station. I couldn't hear the whole conversation, but I heard him give our coordinates and say the words, "Possible 1057, which I later learned was code for a dead body, followed by, "Situation feels wrong." He told the crew to pack up our tools for the day. A team of rangers was on their way. We hiked back to our truck in near silence. I never found out what they discovered in that thicket. Gus never mentioned it again, and I was too afraid to ask. But I can't get the image of that little teddy bear and the freshly carved words out of my head. "I'm here." It wasn't a plea for help. It felt like a boast, a proud, terrifying announcement from whatever was rotting away just beyond the thorns. In August of 2016, when I was 16, I went on a week-long canoe trip on the Allagash Waterway with my Boy Scout troop. We were from southern Maine, so it was a long drive up to the remote wilderness of the northern part of the state. The Allagash is a series of lakes and rivers, famous for its beauty and isolation. It was my first time on such a big trip, and since I was the least experienced paddler, they paired me with Connor, the strongest and most skilled scout in our troop. Our canoe was usually positioned in the middle of our group of boats, which meant we had to maintain a steady pace to keep everyone together. My arms were sore almost immediately. On our first day, we paddled across Eagle Lake. On the shore of the lake, we stopped to see the two abandoned steam locomotives, famously known as the ghost trains of the Allagash. The story behind them is not supernatural. They were used for logging operations in the early 1900s and were simply left behind to rust in the woods when the operations ceased. It was still an amazing sight, these two massive iron giants slowly being reclaimed by the forest. We spent about an hour climbing on them, careful of the rusted metal, before getting back in our canoes. The lake was huge, so after paddling for a while longer, our leaders decided to tie all the canoes together and use a small motor to pull us across the rest of the way. Our line of canoes formed a giant floating snake that moved slowly across the water. I was so tired from the morning's paddling that I started to doze off, only to be woken up by a sudden jolt as our canoe bumped into the one in front of us. We eventually reached our first campsite, and I was so exhausted that I set up the tent I was sharing with my friend Aaron and fell asleep before dinner was even ready. The next morning, we were up at 5:30, packing up camp. The day was fairly normal. We paddled down a river until we reached a section of whitewater called the Chase Rapids. We had to unload all of our gear into a trailer, which was driven down to the end of the rapids, while we paddled our now much lighter canoes through the turbulent water. It was a lot of fun. We continued down the river and set up camp at our next site. That night is when things got really strange. After dinner, we all sat on the riverbank, watching the stars. With no city lights for hundreds of miles, the night sky was absolutely breathtaking. It was a blanket of purples and blues, pierced by millions of brilliant stars. Around 10 o'clock, everyone started heading to their tents to go to sleep. I stood outside my tent for a moment, looking up at the sky one last time. As I was watching, I noticed one star that seemed to be moving. It was not moving fast like a shooting star, but slowly, and it appeared to be getting bigger, as if it was coming closer. I stood there, mesmerized, as the star grew larger and larger until it stopped, hovering silently almost directly above our campsite. My first thought was that it was a drone or a helicopter, but it made no sound at all. I reached my hand up toward it, half expecting my hand to pass through a beam of light, but the object was solid. My fingertips touched a surface that was as smooth as glass and ice cold, like it had just been taken out of a deep freezer. I could now see that it was not a star, but a glowing white, oval-shaped craft. Suddenly, a bright beam of light shot down from the oval, enveloping me completely. I felt a strange tingling sensation all over my body, especially at the back of my neck. I felt myself being lifted off the ground, my feet dangling in the air. The sensation was bizarre, like my body was a sponge being filled with water, as I was slowly absorbed up into the glowing oval. I found myself in a dark, cold room. A thick, metallic-smelling mist filled the air, making it hard to breathe. It stung my eyes and my lungs, and my entire body quickly went numb. Then, I blacked out. I awoke in a room that was completely white. The light was incredibly bright, but I could not see where it was coming from. There were no light fixtures, no windows, just a seamless white environment. My ears were ringing loudly, and the bright light was making my eyes ache. I was lying flat on my back on a cold metal slab. I tried to move, but I was completely paralyzed. I could not even turn my head. The ringing in my ears grew louder and more painful until it was almost unbearable. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something moving. Sliding slowly toward me was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. It was tall and thin, with skin the color of wet clay. It had a large, bulbous head with two enormous, black, almond-shaped eyes that seemed to have no pupils. It had two small slits for nostrils, and below them, just a series of folds of skin where a mouth should have been. A single, long arm protruded from the center of its chest, ending in a hand with four long, thin fingers. It moved toward me on four spindly legs that dragged behind its body. As it got closer, the ringing in my ears became even more intense. It leaned over me, its huge black eyes staring down at me. In its hand, it held a long, silver, needle-like instrument. The creature brought the needle toward my face and inserted it into my mouth. The moment I felt the cold metal on my tongue, I lost consciousness again. When I woke up, I was lying in the shallow water at the edge of the river, soaking wet and freezing cold. I could not remember anything that had happened. The next day, we continued our trip as if nothing was wrong. It was not until that night, when one of the adult leaders was telling a campfire story about alien encounters, that the memories came flooding back in a terrifying rush. I have never told anyone the full story of what happened to me that night. I have no desire to ever go camping in the deep woods again. When I was a teenager, I was really into camping by myself. My grandparents owned a large piece of property out in the countryside, miles from the nearest town, and I had a favorite spot deep in their woods that I considered my own. To get there, I had to hike for a couple of miles and cross through a few neighboring properties. One of these properties was a large pasture that belonged to a cattle rancher. I always tried to be respectful and careful when crossing his land, especially around the cows. Cattle are usually pretty docile, but you never want to startle a herd, so I would always give them a wide berth. The pasture was about a mile from my grandparents' house and marked the halfway point to my camping spot. One summer weekend, I packed my gear and headed out for a solo trip. As I slipped through the barbed wire fence into the pasture, I immediately noticed that something was off. Normally, the cows would be spread out, lazily grazing, but this time, they were all bunched together in a tight group on the far side of the field. They were restless and agitated, stomping their feet and making low, nervous sounds. They seemed spooked by something I could not see or hear. I decided to stay as far away from them as possible and cut across the opposite end of the pasture, which added some time to my hike, but it felt like the safe thing to do. I continued on my way and had a great night of camping. The sky was clear and the woods were peaceful. The next morning, I packed up my camp and started the hike back home. As I approached the pasture, I was hit by an absolutely horrendous smell. It was a thick, gag-inducing stench, like a mixture of rotten meat, skunk spray, and manure, all baking in the sun. It was one of the worst things I've ever smelled. I tried to look around for the source of the smell and to locate the herd of cows to make sure I did not surprise them. But as I scanned the pasture, I realized they were gone. The entire herd, which must have been at least 50 or 60 animals, was nowhere in sight. I figured they must have been moved to a different pasture or were hiding in a grove of trees, so I kept walking. The smell got stronger and stronger as I got closer to the center of the field. It was so bad I had to cover my nose and mouth with my shirt. I set my backpack and gear down by the fence line on the other side of the pasture and decided to investigate the source of the smell. I followed the stench to a shallow ravine that ran through the middle of the property. What I found there made my stomach turn. It was the entire herd of cows. They had all been shot, each one with a precise hole in its head. But that was not the worst part. Someone had then systematically butchered every single one of them. They had been ripped open and disemboweled, their insides piled next to their bodies in the shallow ditch. It was a gruesome, horrific scene of carnage. It was not the work of predators. It was deliberate and methodical. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. Whoever had done this could still be around. I backed away slowly, then turned and ran back to the fence line to grab my gear and get out of there. But when I got back to the spot where I had left my stuff, it was gone. My backpack, my sleeping bag, my tent, everything. I had set it down right next to a large, distinctive rock, and I had only been gone for maybe 10 minutes. It was in plain sight of where I was, and I had not seen or heard anyone. I did a quick search of the immediate area, hoping it had just fallen or been dragged away by an animal, but there was no sign of it. Nothing was ripped or scattered. It had just vanished. That is when the terror really kicked in. Someone was out there. Someone who had just slaughtered an entire herd of cattle was watching me. I did not wait around to find out who it was. I think I ran that mile back to my grandparents' house in record time, not stopping or looking back once. I never told anyone what I saw. I was scared and did not know how to explain it. I never heard anything about the dead cows, and I never went back to my old camping spot again. The memory of that smell and the sight of what had been done to those animals, combined with my mysteriously vanishing gear, still creeps me out to this day. My dad doesn't talk much about his past, especially not his time working as a logger in the Pacific Northwest during the late 90s. The stories I do know, I've had to piece together from fragments, overheard conversations, and the haunted look that sometimes comes over his face when he thinks no one is watching. He operated a feller buncher, a monstrous machine that can shear through massive trees like they're toothpicks. It was a job that paid well but demanded everything. He would spend weeks at a time deep in the forest, living out of a small camper, often completely alone. The way his crew operated was simple. The company would map out a section of forest, and Dad would go in first, clearing the trees. He was paid by the tree, not by the hour, so he pushed himself to the absolute limit, working from before sunrise until long after sunset. After he was done, the rest of the crew would come in to process the timber and haul it out. For this particular job in the fall of 2001, he He was working with another operator named Manny, a quiet, grizzled man who had been logging for over 30 years. They were assigned to a tract of land so remote, it took them almost a week just to clear a path for their equipment to get up the mountain. It was true isolation. No cell service, no towns for 100 miles, just them and the endless trees. About 10 days into the job, strange things started happening. They began hearing weird, garbled chatter over their radios. It wasn't another logging crew. The quality was terrible, like a cheap walkie-talkie, and no matter what channel they switched to, the faint, staticky voices would follow. At first, it was just noise, but as they worked their way further up the mountain, the transmissions became clearer. They could never make out full sentences, just snippets of conversation that sounded tense and secretive. Both Dad and Manny agreed that something was wrong. These weren't hunters or hikers. They also started finding signs that other people were nearby. Not just a stray beer can, but odd things. Small, carefully constructed containers made of birch bark. Piles of rocks arranged in strange patterns. Things that felt ritualistic. People had no business being this deep in the woods. This was a private logging area, miles up a mountain road they had essentially built themselves. The realization slowly dawned on them. They were in a very secluded area, and they were not alone. The worst part was, they weren't scheduled to head back down the mountain for supplies for another 5 days. They were stuck. One afternoon, Manny was scouting a new area to cut when he stumbled upon a small hidden campsite. He called my dad over on the radio. Tucked away in a dense thicket was a single dirty tent. Inside, they found a lone sleeping bag and a canvas duffel bag. My dad said a cold feeling washed over him as Manny unzipped the bag. It was filled with children's clothing, mostly girls' underwear, along with a roll of duct tape, a length of rope, and a sketchbook. My dad only glanced at the sketchbook, but what he saw burned itself into his memory. Crude, horrifying drawings of children in terrible situations. There were also a few Polaroid photos of kids who looked terrified, clearly aware their picture was being taken. In the corner of the tent was a small stash of food, including a fresh, unblemished apple. Whoever lived here had been back recently. They were alone on a mountain with a monster. Manny, a man who had seen everything the woods could throw at him, wanted to pack up and leave right then. But my dad, stubborn and driven by the need to provide for his family, insisted they finish the job. He was the hardest working man I've ever known, sometimes to his own detriment. They made a pact. They would stop using their radios for anything other than emergencies. Instead, they would leave them on, listening, trying to figure out who was out there with them. That night, the voices on the radio were clearer than ever. They could now hear 2 men talking. The conversation was mundane, gathering firewood, fetching water, but hearing it, knowing it was coming from the owners of that tent, was terrifying. At the end of his shift the next day, Dad heard one of the men say he was heading out to collect brush for the fire. On a dangerous impulse, my dad grabbed his radio handset. He keyed the mic and said, his voice steady, "Who are you, and what are you doing on this mountain?" The conversation on the other end stopped instantly. The radio went completely silent, and it stayed silent for the rest of the night. That evening, they locked themselves in my dad's small camper. Sometime after midnight, Manny shook my dad awake, his hand over my dad's mouth. He whispered one frantic sentence. "Someone's outside." My dad strained his ears and heard it too. The quiet, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the gravel just outside their thin metal door. Dad fumbled in the dark for the handgun he kept under his bunk, his heart pounding. He found the gun, but realized with a surge of panic that it wasn't loaded, and the box of ammunition was somewhere in a storage compartment. Manny had nothing but his fists. Calling the police was a joke. They were hours from civilization. They heard a soft rattle at the doorknob. Then, with a faint click, the door swung open. The camper was raised high off the ground, with no steps. Whoever was out there would have to hoist themselves up to get inside. The doorway remained a black, empty rectangle. Neither my dad nor Manny moved a muscle. They just listened. Then came a new sound. A dry, scraping noise right on the threshold of the open door. It went on for what felt like an hour, a slow, methodical scratching. My dad said it was the worst sound he'd ever heard. He couldn't take it anymore. He looked at Manny and nodded. Manny silently got to his feet and crept towards the open door. The second his silhouette filled the doorway, all hell broke loose. A figure lunged out of the darkness, and Manny was hit with something that made a sickening crack. He flew backward, hitting the floor of the camper hard. A man with a long hunting knife scrambled into the camper on top of him. My dad launched himself forward, just as a second man appeared in the doorway and kicked him square in the side of the head. The world exploded in a flash of white pain for my dad. When his vision cleared, he saw Manny, a man twice his size, grappling with the man with the knife. The second intruder, the one without a weapon, seemed to lose his nerve. He jumped down from the camper and started running into the woods. The man with the knife managed to break free from Manny's grip, scrambled out the door and ran after his partner. My dad and Manny didn't wait. They jumped into their pickup truck, Manny bleeding from a deep gash on his forehead, and drove like madmen down the mountain. They went straight to the nearest hospital, where my dad was treated for a severe concussion and Manny got stitched up. They told the police everything. They quit their jobs the next day. About 2 weeks later, the rest of the logging crew went up the mountain to finish the job and retrieve the company's equipment. One of the loggers, a young guy in his 20s, was found in a ditch near the edge of the site. He had been bound, assaulted, and murdered. No one was ever arrested. The men and the tent were gone. My father came home a different man. He never worked in the deep woods again, and ever since that night he has never, not once, slept all the way through until morning. My older brother, Mark, is the kind of guy who seems like he was born a century too late. He was a Marine for 8 years, did a couple of tours that he still doesn't talk about, and when he got out, the modern world just didn't fit him right. He found his peace in the mountains, learning traditional hunting and survival skills. He wasn't a trophy hunter. His philosophy was about respecting nature, using every part of the animal, and understanding the world in a way most people in 2022 never will. His best friend in this endeavor was a guy from the Paiute tribe who taught him how to make his own longbow and flint-knapped arrowheads. For Mark, it was a connection to something real. I, on the other hand, was a city kid through and through, but I looked up to my brother, and when he invited me on a deer hunting trip into a remote part of the Sierra Nevada in California, I couldn't say no. He wanted to show me what he loved about the wilderness. We were heading to a specific basin that was miles from any official trail, an area known for being rugged and unforgiving. There were old whispers among the locals about people who had gone up into those mountains decades ago and never came back down, not because they were lost, but because they didn't want to. Hermits, survivalists, maybe even a cult or two. People said they were still up there, living off the grid, and not particularly fond of visitors. We laughed it off as local folklore, something to tell tourists. We drove for hours, the paved roads turning to gravel, then to a dirt track that was barely passable in Mark's old pickup. We finally parked and hiked for the better part of a day, climbing steadily until the air grew thin and crisp. We set up our camp high on a ridge, in a small cluster of ancient pine trees overlooking a wide, moonlight clearing. It gave us a perfect vantage point. Mark's plan was to wait for the full moon to rise, which would illuminate the clearing like a stadium light, making it easier to spot any deer that came to graze. As dusk settled, the silence of the high Sierras was absolute. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was heavy, like the entire world was holding its breath. After a few hours of waiting in our makeshift tree stand, a small platform Mark had expertly secured between two thick pines, I had to answer nature's call. He told me to go a good distance away, downwind, so our scent wouldn't spook any animals. It was around 11 at night, and the moon was magnificent, a giant silver disk in a star-dusted sky. It cast long, sharp shadows that seemed to move on their own. I felt confident, leaving my headlamp behind because the moonlight was so bright. I walked about 100 yards from our perch, found a spot, and did my business. As I was finishing up, a single fat cloud drifted lazily in front of the moon. The world plunged into an inky, disorienting blackness. It was so sudden and total that I felt a jolt of primal fear. I stood perfectly still, waiting for my eyes to adjust, but they couldn't. It was like being at the bottom of a well. That's when I heard it. It started as a low humming, then escalated into a sound that I can only describe as a chorus of pained laughter. It wasn't animalistic. It was distinctly human, but wrong. It sounded like multiple people laughing and screaming at the same time, a sound of pure, unhinged mania. It echoed off the granite walls of the basin, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. It seemed to be everywhere at once. My blood turned to ice. All the stories about wild people in the mountains flooded my mind. Mark had seen some terrible things overseas, but I had never experienced anything but the predictable safety of urban life. This sound was not safe. It was the sound of chaos. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted blindly back in the direction I thought our tree stand was, crashing through underbrush, my arms held up to protect my face. The laughing and screaming seemed to get closer, swirling around me. I tripped over a root and fell hard, scraping my hands and face on the rocky ground. I scrambled behind a large boulder, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would break them. I was gasping for air, trying not to make a sound. The cloud finally passed, and the moonlight flooded the landscape again. I was terrified to see that I had run in the wrong direction. I was at the far end of the clearing, farther away from my brother than when I had started. The screaming laughter was still echoing, but it seemed a bit more distant now. Shaking, I located our cluster of pines and found the tree with our stand. I didn't even use the rope ladder we had set up. I clawed my way up that tree like a panicked animal, tearing my fingernails and not even feeling it. My only thought was to get to Mark. When I finally scrambled onto the platform, he was sitting there, perfectly calm, holding his bow. I was a mess, hyperventilating, trying to whisper that the cannibals, the wild people, were here, and we were going to die. He just looked at me, and a small smile touched his lips. He put a hand on my shoulder to steady me. "Breathe," he whispered. "That's not people. It's deer. It's the sound they make during the rut. It's rare to hear it like this, so many at once. We're actually lucky." I stared at him, incredulous. Relief washed over me so intensely that I felt weak. I almost wanted to punch him, but then I started to laugh, a shaky, hysterical laugh. Deer. All that terror over deer getting it on. We shared a quiet laugh, and he pointed out how the activity meant we were in a prime spot. We would likely get a buck tonight. Just as we settled back into our watch, a group of about 8 or 9 deer gracefully entered the clearing. They began to graze peacefully. Mark slowly reached for an arrow, his movements fluid and silent. I held my breath, but then, all at once, every single deer froze. Their heads all snapped up in the same direction, towards the far side of the clearing. A moment later they bolted, a silent stampede that vanished into the darkness of the surrounding forest in seconds. The clearing was empty and silent again. Mark and I exchanged a confused look. What could spook an entire herd like that? A mountain lion? A bear? Then we saw them. 3 figures emerged from the trees where the deer had been looking. They were walking slowly, carrying something heavy between them. It was long and wrapped in what looked like a dark tarp, but it sagged in the middle with a dead weight that was unmistakably human. They moved directly into the center of the clearing, bathed in the bright moonlight. They looked gaunt and wiry, dressed in patched, dark clothing. Their faces were smudged with something dark, maybe mud or paint. They weren't speaking, just moving with a grim purpose. I started to ask Mark if he was seeing what I was seeing, but he clamped his hand firmly over my mouth before I could make a sound. His eyes were wide and deadly serious. We stayed perfectly still, hidden in the shadows of the pine branches. The figures carried their burden across the clearing and disappeared into the woods on the other side. They never once looked up. After they were gone, an eternity of silence passed. Finally, Mark slowly removed his hand from my mouth. He didn't say a word. He just began methodically counting his arrows. He laid them out on the platform. 12 custom arrows, with the flint heads he had spent weeks crafting. He counted them 3 times. Then he whispered, "We don't sleep tonight, not a wink, and we don't make a sound." For the rest of the night, he sat facing the direction the figures had gone, occasionally murmuring something soft under his breath. It sounded like a prayer. We stayed awake until the sun came up, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The morning was bright and clear, and the woods looked completely normal, peaceful even. We carefully climbed down, leaving all our gear except for our packs and Mark's bow in the stand. We just wanted out of there. The hike back to the truck felt twice as long. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. We didn't stop until we got to the nearest ranger station, a small cabin at the edge of the national forest. We told the ranger on duty what we saw. He looked at us with deep skepticism, asking if we'd been drinking. He even made us take a breathalyzer test, which of course came back clean. Our sober earnestness must have convinced him something was up, because he agreed to go back with a couple of other rangers to check out the clearing and help us retrieve our gear. When we got back to the site, Mark and I packed up our things from the tree stand, while the rangers fanned out to search the clearing. A few minutes later, one of them called out. They had found a trail of dark, splattered spots on the ground. They used a field kit to test it. It wasn't animal blood. It was human. We left immediately after that. Later that day, back at my apartment, we were cleaning our equipment. We were both meticulous about our gear. Mark was wiping down his bow when he suddenly froze. He looked at me, his face pale. He told me he started the trip with 2 quivers, 6 arrows in each, 12 total. He had counted them on the platform after we saw the figures. Now, as he put them away, he only had 9. 3 were missing. Our gear had been strapped down securely in the stand when we left that morning. Someone must have climbed the tree after we left for the ranger station and taken them. They had been watching us. Mark got rid of his bow and arrows after that. He said they had bad energy attached to them now. We later heard through a friend of a friend in law enforcement that the blood sample matched a missing person from a few years back, a hiker who had vanished in that same area. But they never found a body, and with no other evidence, our story was just that, a story. The case remained cold. I know what I heard that night wasn't just deer, and I know what we saw was real. We never went hunting in the Sierras again. I moved to Portland, Oregon, about 5 years ago for a fresh start after college. I did not know anyone in the city, so I was trying to be open to meeting new people. A few weeks after I settled into my new apartment, I met a guy named Kevin at a local coffee shop. He was charming and funny, and we hit it off right away. We started hanging out regularly, and before long, we were officially dating. Kevin was a great guy, but he had a very intense friendship with his childhood best friend, Mark. They had known each other since they were kids and had met at a summer camp for visually impaired children. Mark had a degenerative eye condition that made him legally blind, and he relied on Kevin for a lot of things. After Kevin and I had been together for about a month, he decided it was time for me to meet Mark and his other close friend, Ben. He invited them over to my apartment for dinner. I cooked a big meal, and for the most part, the evening went really well. We all got along, and I could see why Kevin valued his friends so much. Later in the evening, after we had finished eating, we were all sitting in the living room just talking. The mood was relaxed and fun. Ben left around 11, but Mark needed a ride home since he could not drive. Kevin offered to take him. About an hour later, Kevin came back to my apartment looking shaken. He told me that the car ride with Mark had been a complete nightmare. Apparently, as soon as they left, Mark started yelling at him. He went on a bizarre, angry rant about how Kevin always got everything he wanted, how he always got the great girl, and how I was everything Mark had ever looked for in a woman. While I was a little flattered, the intensity of the outburst was really concerning. Mark then demanded that Kevin pull over and let him walk the rest of the way home. Kevin refused, telling him it was 1 a.m. and he was in an unfamiliar neighborhood. But Mark became so agitated that he opened the passenger door while the car was still moving and tried to jump out. Kevin had no choice but to pull over and let him go. When Kevin got back and told me what happened, I felt terrible. I could not stand the thought of Mark, who could barely see, wandering around a strange part of the city alone at night. Mark had already sent Kevin a text telling him to leave him alone, so I decided to go find him myself. I got in my car and drove to where Kevin had dropped him off. I found him standing on a street corner just a few feet from where he had gotten out of the car. I convinced him to get in my car and drove him home. The next day, Kevin tried to talk to Mark about what had happened, but it just turned into another huge argument. A few weeks went by and things were tense. Then, one afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. It was Mark. I have no idea how he got my number, because Kevin swore he did not give it to him. He started the conversation by apologizing for his behavior that night. It seemed sincere at first, but then the call took a very weird turn. He started talking about how much he liked me, how he knew from the moment he met me that I was special. He went on and on about how he needed a girl like me in his life. Then he started trash-talking Kevin, his supposed best friend of over 20 years. He told me about all of Kevin's past girlfriends and painted him as a terrible person who did not deserve me. He said I deserved someone better, someone like him. The whole conversation made me incredibly uncomfortable. I told him I had to go and hung up. That evening, I told Kevin about the phone call. He was furious, which was understandable. I tried to downplay it, saying that I thought Mark was just lonely and probably had a bit of a crush. Kevin let it go, and a few days later, he and Mark seemed to have made up. But things were still weird. They went out to lunch one day, and while they were there, I got a text from Kevin's phone asking me to meet them at the restaurant. When I showed up, I found out that Kevin had never sent the text. Mark had taken his phone while he was in the bathroom and messaged me. It was a strange, manipulative thing to do, and it caused another huge fight between them. I went home feeling upset and caught in the middle of their drama. I hated seeing two lifelong friends fighting, especially over me. Kevin came over later that night to apologize for everything, and we watched a movie to try and relax. He left around midnight. About 15 minutes after he was gone, my phone rang. It was an unknown number again. I answered, and it was Mark. He sounded panicked and told me there was an emergency. He said he was at the hospital and that Kevin was not answering his phone. Mark's eye condition, retinoblastoma, was a form of cancer, so I immediately thought the worst. I threw on some clothes, jumped in my car, and headed for the hospital. On the way, I called Kevin and left him a voicemail explaining what was going on. When I got to the hospital, I went to the front desk, but there was no record of anyone with Mark's name being admitted. I tried calling his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Confused and worried, I drove back to my apartment. When I pulled into my long, dark driveway, I saw a figure sitting on my front steps. It was Mark. He stood up as I got out of my car, and my blood ran cold. I asked him what was going on, my voice shaking. He started walking toward me, telling me again how much he loved me and how Kevin did not deserve me. He said if I would just give him a chance, he could make me so happy. With every sentence, he got closer and I kept backing away toward my car. His expression was intense and scary. I yelled at him to stop and to leave, threatening to call the police. He just kept coming. I reached into my pocket for my phone, but it was not there. I had left it in the car. I turned and made a run for it. I could hear his footsteps right behind me. I managed to unlock the car and jump inside just as he reached the door. I was frantically dialing 911 when a pair of headlights flooded the driveway. It was Kevin's car. He had Ben with him. I guess they had gone to the hospital looking for Mark after they got my voicemail. They both got out and managed to calm Mark down and convince him to leave. Kevin was endlessly apologetic. He and Ben stayed with me that night to make sure I was okay. The next day, Kevin officially ended his friendship with Mark and told him that if he ever came near me again, we would get a restraining order. Months went by, and we did not hear anything from Mark. It was New Year's Eve, and Kevin was hosting a party at his apartment. We were all having a good time, finally moving on from the whole creepy situation. Around 11:30, the doorbell rang. I went to answer it, and my stomach dropped. Standing on the doorstep was Mark, and with him was Kevin's ex-girlfriend, an old high school sweetheart named Jessica. I almost slammed the door in their faces. Kevin came up behind me, confused about what was happening. It turned out that Mark had been harassing Jessica for the last few months, doing the same thing to her that he did to me. He had been calling her, telling her how much Kevin missed her, and trying to convince her to get back together with him, all while also telling her how much he loved her. She had finally gotten fed up with his bizarre behavior and told him to meet her at Kevin's party to confront him. Both Jessica and I ended up filing police reports, and we both got restraining orders against him. It was a terrifying end to a year that had been filled with his creepy and relentless obsession. A couple of years ago, a few of my buddies and I decided to go camping for a weekend. We found a great spot next to a lake, far away from any official campgrounds. It was just us, a campfire, and the woods. The first night was perfect. We grilled some food, told stories, and just enjoyed being away from everything. We stayed up pretty late, and around 1:30 in the morning, we were all sitting around the dying embers of the fire when we heard a rustling sound in the bushes nearby. We all went quiet and listened. It was probably just a raccoon or a rabbit, so we were not too worried. A couple of us went over with a flashlight to check it out, but we could not find anything. We shrugged it off and went back to the fire. About 5 minutes later, we heard a different sound. It was the low rumble of an engine. We looked toward the dirt road that ran along the edge of our campsite and saw a pair of headlights approaching. A huge, lifted pickup truck came crawling down the road, moving incredibly slowly. Loud, aggressive music was blasting from its speakers, echoing through the quiet woods. As the truck got closer, a powerful spotlight mounted on its roof switched on, and the beams swept across our campsite, blinding us. The light lingered on each of us for a few seconds before moving to the next person. It was a deliberate, intimidating act. The truck then peeled out, kicking up a cloud of dust, and sped off down the road. The whole encounter was bizarre and left us all feeling really uneasy. It felt like they were sending us a message, or maybe scoping us out. My best friend Dave and I were the most rattled by it. We decided to hop in my car and drive up to the main road to see if we could spot the truck or get a license plate number. We just had a bad feeling about the whole thing. We drove up the dirt road for about a mile until we reached the paved highway. As we turned onto the main road, we were met with a shocking scene. The road was blocked off with about a dozen police cars, their lights flashing and cutting through the darkness. There were also 2 or 3 ambulances parked on the side of the road. We slowed down, planning to turn around, when a police officer suddenly appeared at my window, tapping on the glass with his flashlight. He seemed to appear out of nowhere, like something from a horror movie. My heart jumped into my throat. He asked us what we were doing out there so late. We explained that we were camping down by the lake and told him about the creepy pickup truck that had just driven by our site. The officer's expression became very serious. He leaned in closer and said, "Well, you boys might want to find somewhere else to camp tonight. We just had a triple homicide here, and we have not located the suspect yet." A chill went down my spine. My friend Dave, in a moment of sheer stupidity, asked, "So, should we be scared?" The cop looked at him, then looked at me, his face grim. He said something I will never forget. "Well, I am not scared," he said. "But there are 20 officers here, and we all have guns." He did not have to say anything else. I just said, "Yes, sir," and slammed my foot on the gas, making a sharp U-turn and speeding back down the dirt road. As soon as we got back to the campsite, Dave called our other friends who were still there and told them to pack up everything immediately and not to ask any questions. We did not want to waste a second explaining and risk the killer coming back. When we got there, it was controlled chaos. We literally ripped our fully pitched tents out of the ground, stakes and all, and threw them into the back of one of the trucks. We tossed our coolers, sleeping bags, and all our gear in a frantic pile. We were not leaving anything behind. We jumped in our vehicles and got the hell out of there, driving way too fast on that bumpy dirt road. The next day, we saw the news report. The police had located and arrested the killer about 30 minutes after we had spoken to the officer. They found him hiding in the woods, right near our campsite. We had been just a few hundred yards away from a murderer who was on the run. The thought of what could have happened if that guy had stumbled upon our camp in the middle of the night still terrifies me. We were lucky to get out of there when we did. During my junior year of college, I practically lived at the university library. It was my sanctuary, the one place I could actually focus. My apartment was in a quiet, residential suburb of Boston, a little over a mile from campus. The walk home was usually peaceful, through tree-lined streets with well-kept houses. I had made that walk hundreds, maybe thousands of times, at all hours of the day and night. It felt as safe as my own living room. One night in late October, I was at the library until it closed at 2 a.m., cramming for a midterm. When I finally left, the streets were deserted. It was a cold, clear night, and the silence was absolute. I was about halfway home when I got the distinct feeling that I was no longer alone. It wasn't anything I saw or heard, just a shift in the atmosphere, a prickle of instinct. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a figure, a man, walking about a block behind me on the same side of the street. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was a residential area. He was probably just a neighbor walking home too. But he was walking at the exact same pace as me. I decided to test it. I stopped at a corner, pretending to check my phone for a message. I lingered for a full 30 seconds. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him stop too, at the previous corner, just standing there. The moment I started walking again, so did he. My heart started to beat a little faster. This was not a coincidence. I picked up my pace, my casual stroll turning into a power walk. I could hear his footsteps behind me, speeding up to match mine. He wasn't trying to be stealthy. It felt like a game to him. I was getting closer to my street, and a new wave of fear hit me. I couldn't let him see which house was mine. I made a split-second decision and took a sharp right turn onto a street I didn't live on, a long loop that would eventually bring me back around. He made the turn right after me. Now I was genuinely scared. My mind raced. Should I scream? There was no one around to hear me. Should I run? That might provoke him. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. I unlocked it and held it in my hand, ready to dial 911. My driveway was just a couple of 100 feet away, around the next corner. I thought if I could just get to my front door, I would be safe. As I turned onto my street, I broke into a jog. I could see my house, the porch, like my mum always left on for me, a welcoming beacon. I ran up the walkway, my keys already in my hand. Just as I was about to jam the key into the lock, the screech of tires and the bright flash of headlights filled the street. A car was turning into my neighbor's driveway. In the sudden flood of light, I risked a glance back. The man was standing at the edge of my lawn, not 10 feet from me. The headlights had caught him by surprise. He froze for a second, like a deer, then quickly turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I scrambled inside, locked and deadbolted the door, and leaned against it, my body trembling. I was safe, but the feeling of safety was gone. He had been on my property. He had almost reached my front door. My mum heard me come in and found me shaking in the entryway. I told her what happened. She called the police, but there was nothing they could do. They drove around the neighborhood, but saw no one matching the man's vague description. For the next few weeks, I was a nervous wreck. I didn't go to the library at night anymore, but life has to go on, and slowly, the fear began to fade. About a month later, I was home alone on a Saturday night. I decided to take a long, hot shower to distress. I was in the bathroom, the water running, the room filled with steam. The bathroom window was high on the wall and made of frosted glass, so you couldn't see clearly through it, but it let in light. As I was washing my hair, I heard a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I froze, the water beating down on my shoulders. It couldn't be a branch. There were no trees close enough to the house. The tapping stopped, and then I saw it. A dark shape, a silhouette, pressed against the frosted glass, the shape of a hand. Someone was outside, standing on something to reach the window, trying to peer inside. I didn't scream. I was too terrified to make a sound. I slowly reached over and turned off the water. The house was completely silent. I stood there, naked and dripping, staring at the dark handprint on the glass. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. I backed away from the window, grabbed a towel, and crept out of the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I ran to my parents' bedroom and called 911, whispering into the phone that there was someone outside my house. By the time the police arrived, whoever it was long gone. They found footprints in the flower bed under the bathroom window and scuff marks on the side of the house where someone had braced themselves to climb up. It was him. I know it was him. He had come back. We installed a security system and floodlights after that, but I never truly felt safe in that house again. The image of that hand pressed against the glass is something I'll never be able to forget. It was a reminder that even when you think you've escaped the darkness, it can still find a way to your window. When I was 19, my life felt like it had completely fallen apart. I had gone through a messy, soul-crushing breakup, and I felt untethered, like a ship without an anchor. To try and find my footing again, I decided to do something drastic. I packed a bag, bought a bus ticket, and set out to hike a long section of the Appalachian Trail in northern Georgia. I wasn't an expert hiker, but I craved the solitude and the physical challenge. I needed to be somewhere that my problems couldn't follow me. For the first week, it was exactly what I needed. The rhythm of walking, the ache in my muscles, and the simple tasks of setting up camp and filtering water cleared my head. But on my 8th day, things took a turn. I was running low on water, and the map showed the next reliable spring was still a few miles ahead. I decided to venture off the main trail, following the contour of the land downwards into a small valley where I hoped to find a stream. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The usual chatter of birds and insects faded away, replaced by an unnerving silence. Then I heard a sound. It was faint at first, a high-pitched metallic tinkling. It wasn't natural. As I got closer, it sounded like a single small bell, or maybe a spoon tapping rhythmically against a tin can. Curiosity got the better of my caution, and I followed the sound. It led me to a small, hidden clearing. The first things I saw were the structures. There were dozens of them, little teepee-like constructions no more than 2 feet high. As I got closer, I realized they weren't made of sticks and leaves. They were made of bones. Small animal bones, squirrels, rabbits, birds, all intricately woven together with twine and strips of sinew. The tinkling sound was coming from one of them, where a small, rusty bell was hanging from the top, swaying in the faint breeze. The entire clearing was a miniature boneyard, a bizarre and unsettling art installation in the middle of nowhere. My unease grew, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I felt compelled to see what else was there. A narrow, barely there path led from the clearing further down into the valley. I followed it. At the bottom of a small hill, tucked against a rock face, was a larger structure. It was a crude hut, big enough for a person to live in. built from the same materials as the small ones: logs, bark, and a disturbing amount of animal bones reinforcing the walls. Hanging around the entrance were dozens of animal pelts, but they weren't clean and tanned. They were rotting, covered in flies, the fur matted with dried gore. Strung between them were handmade dolls. They were small, made of twigs and cloth, but their hair wasn't yarn. It was human hair, in different colours and textures. My stomach lurched, but the most horrifying thing was the arrangement on the ground in front of the hut. The carcasses of dozens of birds, crows, blue jays, cardinals, were laid out in a large, perfect spiral. Their eyes were missing. This wasn't a hunter's camp. This was something else entirely. This was a shrine to death. The metallic tinkling of the bell from the clearing above seemed to mock the dead silence of this place. I finally understood that I was trespassing in a place I was never meant to see. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound. I turned and ran. I didn't care about my pack, my gear, or the water I so desperately needed. I just ran, scrambling back up the hill, away from the hut and its silent, dead guardians. I didn't stop running until I was back on the familiar dirt of the Appalachian Trail. I didn't look back. I hiked for the rest of the day and into the night, pushing myself until I was utterly exhausted, putting as much distance as possible between me and that valley. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dolls with their human hair and the birds with their empty eye sockets. The faint, tinkling sound of the bell echoed in my head. The next day, I reached a road crossing where I was able to get a ride into the nearest town. I went straight to the ranger station and told them what I had found. I described the bone structures, the dolls, and the hut. The ranger I spoke to looked at me with a mixture of pity and disbelief, probably thinking I was just some spooked kid with an overactive imagination. He took my name and number, pointed out the area on a map based on my description, and told me they would look into it. He said it was probably just some local eccentric. His casual dismissal made me feel even more unsettled. I knew what I saw wasn't the work of a harmless eccentric. It was the work of someone deeply disturbed, someone who lived in a world of decay and violence. I never heard back from the rangers. I ended my hike that day and took a bus home. I never went back to the trail, and to this day, I can't stand the sound of a small bell ringing. I've always been drawn to the quiet hours, so when I was 19, working the night shift at a 24-hour roadside diner in a small Arizona town seemed perfect. It was the kind of place that attracted a mix of long-haul truckers, insomniacs, and lost souls passing through on their way to somewhere else. I liked the solitude, the low hum of the coffee machine, and the endless stream of transient stories. Most of the regulars were harmless, but in the dead of night, you learn to develop a sixth sense for trouble. My sixth sense started screaming the first time a trucker named Rick sat in my section. He wasn't like the others. He had a way of looking at you that felt like he was peeling back layers, trying to see what was underneath. He drove the same route every week, and he started making a point of stopping at our diner only when I was working. The first few times, it was just slightly too long stares and compliments that felt more like assessments. I handled it the way most women in service jobs do, with a polite, professional smile and a firm, emotional wall. One night, things escalated. The diner was empty except for him. He called me over to his table, and as I approached, he accidentally knocked his full mug of coffee all over the floor, right at my feet. He was profusely apologetic, insisting that I let him help clean it up. The spill was clearly deliberate, a clumsy excuse to get me to come out from behind the safety of the main counter. I told him it was no problem and that I would handle it, but he insisted. I ended up having to firmly tell him to please remain in his booth. He backed down, but his eyes had a strange, triumphant glint in them. After that, his behavior grew bolder. He started leaving things for me on the windshield of my car, which was always parked in the back of the poorly lit lot. It started with a single wilted rose, then a small cheap teddy bear with a note that said, "For my night angel." It was creepy, but I tried to ignore it, hoping he'd get bored and stop. The last straw was a mixtape, an actual cassette tape in 2018, with "Songs for You" scrawled on the label. I threw it in the dumpster without listening to it and started parking my car on the main street, right under a streetlight in front of the diner. The next week, Rick came in and seemed agitated that my car wasn't in its usual spot. He sat at the counter and tried to make small talk, but I kept my answers short and didn't make eye contact. He eventually left without finishing his meal. I thought maybe, finally, he'd gotten the message. That night, I learned how wrong I was. 2 police officers came into the diner around 3 a.m. One was older, with a tired face, and the other was younger, Officer Miller, who seemed friendly and professional. They said they were just doing a routine check on late-night businesses. Officer Miller struck up a conversation with me, asking if I ever had any trouble working alone. Thinking this was my chance, I cautiously told him about Rick. I described the incidents, trying not to sound hysterical. Officer Miller was incredibly reassuring. He took down my statement, got a description of Rick and his truck, and promised to keep an eye out. He gave me his card with his direct extension and told me to call him any time I felt unsafe. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. Officer Miller started stopping by the diner a couple of times a week, always during my shift. At first, it was comforting. He'd grab a coffee, ask how I was doing, and let me know there had been no sign of Rick. But gradually, the tone of his visits began to change. His questions became less about my safety and more about my personal life. Did I have a boyfriend? What did I like to do on my days off? Where did I go to school? He would lean against the counter, making the diner feel small, his presence filling the empty space. One night, he commented on my necklace. "Is that a gift from someone special?" he asked. I told him it was from my grandmother. He smiled and said, "A pretty necklace for a pretty girl." The comment made my skin crawl. He was a police officer. There was a power imbalance that made the situation feel charged and dangerous. I started to dread his visits more than I had dreaded Rick's. The final, terrifying incident happened about a month after he first came to the diner. I had moved into a new apartment complex on the other side of town and hadn't told anyone at work my new address. It was my day off, and I was at home, watching a movie. Around 10 p.m., there was a loud, forceful knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole, and my heart stopped. It was Officer Miller, in his full uniform. I opened the door just a crack. "Is everything okay, officer?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Just doing a wellness check," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We got an anonymous call expressing concern for your safety. Mind if I come in and take a look around?" I knew there had been no call. He had somehow found out where I lived. He was using his badge to intimidate me, to cross a line that should never be crossed. "I'm fine, really," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "There's no need." "I have to insist," he said, his tone shifting from friendly to firm. "It's procedure." He took a step forward, and I knew I had no choice but to let him in. He walked slowly through my small apartment, his eyes scanning everything. He picked up a framed photo of my college friends from my bookshelf. "You have a lot of friends," he said. "Do they know how dangerous your job is?" He was no longer a protector. He was a threat, cloaking his harassment in the language of concern. After what felt like an eternity, he stood by the door. "All right, everything seems to be in order. Just wanted to make sure you were safe. You know you can call me if you ever need anything. Anything at all." The moment the door closed behind him, I slid down to the floor, shaking uncontrollably. He knew where I lived. He had demonstrated that he could show up any time, under any pretext. The safety of my own home had been violated. The next day, I went to the police station, but not to the front desk. I asked to speak directly to the Internal Affairs Department in the nearest major city. I filed a formal complaint against Officer Miller, detailing everything from his inappropriate questions at the diner to him showing up at my apartment. An investigation was launched. I never saw him again. I quit my job at the diner a week later. I learned that night that monsters don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they wear a uniform and offer to protect you. A year after the incident with the sneaker in Minnesota, Leo and I decided to give our annual camping trip another try. We reasoned that what happened was a fluke, a one-in-a-million creepy occurrence. This time we chose the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas, a place known for its rugged beauty and dense, labyrinthine forests. We hoped that a change of scenery would exorcise the lingering unease from our last trip. Leo had been going through a tough time. He'd recently started taking a new medication for severe anxiety, and while it was helping, he was still adjusting to it. He seemed more on edge than usual, but I figured a week in the woods would be good for him. We found a secluded spot by a creek, deep in a valley surrounded by steep, rocky ridges. The forest was thick with oak and hickory trees, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth. The first couple of days were perfect. We fished, hiked, and sat by the fire, talking late into the night. The old, comfortable rhythm of our friendship returned, and the memory of the little sneaker began to fade. The medication seemed to be working for Leo. He was more relaxed than I'd seen him in months. On the third night, everything changed. We were asleep in our tent when I was jolted awake by violent shaking. Leo was thrashing wildly in his sleeping bag, his eyes wide open but unseeing. He was muttering something, his voice tight with panic. "They're in here," he hissed. "They're everywhere." "Leo, wake up. You're dreaming," I said, grabbing his shoulders. He didn't seem to hear me. He started clawing at his own skin, at the sleeping bag, at the walls of the tent. "Snakes, get them off me. They're all over me." His voice rose to a terrified scream. He was having a night terror, far more intense than anything I'd ever witnessed. He was completely lost in it. In his frenzy, he unzipped the tent door and scrambled outside into the pitch-black night, still screaming about snakes. I dove out after him. He was stumbling towards the dense woods, swatting at his own body. The forest floor was a mess of rocks and roots. He was going to seriously hurt himself. "Leo, stop!" I yelled, my own voice raw with panic. "There are no snakes. You're going to run right off the ridge." The drop-off to the creek was only about 20 feet away, but in the dark, it was a deadly hazard. My shout seemed to break through his terror. He stopped dead, standing in his underwear at the edge of the woods. He slowly turned around, his chest heaving. He looked at the tent, then at me, his eyes slowly coming back into focus. "Mike," he said, his voice laced with confusion. "Why am I outside?" "You had a nightmare," I said, my adrenaline starting to subside. "A really bad one, about snakes." He looked down at his hands, then back at me. "Oh," he said quietly, "they're gone now." He walked calmly back to the tent, got into his sleeping bag, and zipped it up. It was surreal. I stood outside for a few minutes, my heart still racing, trying to process what had just happened. When I got back in the tent, I told him his new medication probably had a side effect of night terrors and he should talk to his doctor. He just grunted in agreement and rolled over. Within minutes, I could hear his steady breathing as he fell back asleep. I, on the other hand, was wide awake. The whole episode had left me deeply unsettled. I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent, listening to the crickets. About 10 minutes passed. Then, I heard it. From high up on the ridge across the valley, a voice echoed through the night. It was a distorted, flat sound, like a voice played through a cheap speaker, and it was repeating my words. "Leo, stop, there are no snakes. You're going to run right off the ridge." My blood ran cold. I sat bolt upright. It wasn't an echo. An echo is immediate, a faint repetition of a sound. This was delayed. It was a perfect, clear mimicry of my own panicked shouts from 10 minutes earlier, and it was coming from a place no person could be. The ridge on the other side of the creek was a sheer rock face, impossible to climb, especially in the dark. I shook Leo awake. "Did you hear that?" I whispered frantically. Hear what? He mumbled, still half asleep. And then it came again, from a slightly different spot along the same ridge, as if the source had moved impossibly fast. Leo, stop. There are no snakes. Now Leo was wide awake too. We stared at each other in the darkness of the tent, not daring to breathe. What was that? It sounded exactly like me, but wrong. The cadence was off, the emotion stripped away, leaving only the words. It was like something was trying to learn how to sound human by replaying what it had heard. We sat there in dead silence for the rest of the night. We didn't talk. We didn't move. We just listened. The voice didn't come back. As soon as the sun rose, we packed our camp. We didn't build a fire. We didn't make breakfast. We just threw our gear into our packs and started the long hike back to the car. We didn't say a word until we were back in the truck, with the doors locked and the engine running. Leo finally broke the silence. That medication, he said, staring straight ahead at the road. The doctor said night terrors were a possible side effect. He didn't say anything about that. I knew it had nothing to do with his medication. Something had been out there with us in the woods. Something that listens and waits and learns. And for a few terrifying minutes, it had decided to talk back. We never went camping again. A few years ago, when I was in high school, my church youth group went on a trip to a big Christian music festival that takes place over New Year's Eve. It is a huge event with concerts, speakers, and all sorts of activities. Our decision to go was very last minute, so by the time we tried to book a place to stay, all the decent hotels near the event were completely full. We ended up having to book rooms at a small rundown roadside motel, about a 30-minute drive away from the festival, pretty much in the middle of nowhere. The entire place looked sketchy from the moment we pulled into the gravel parking lot. The paint was peeling, some of the lights were burned out, and it just had a general feeling of neglect and seediness. But it was our only option, so we tried to make the best of it. We had several rooms booked. The boys were in one room, the chaperones were in another, and all the girls, including me, were in a third room right next to the chaperones. As soon as we got into our room, we noticed something really weird. The room had a back door. I have never seen a motel room with a back door before. It led out to a small dark patch of grass behind the building. One of our chaperones came to check on us and insisted that the back door was sealed shut and could not be opened. Still, she told us that if we heard anyone knocking on it, we should not hesitate to bang on the connecting wall to let them know something was wrong. Not even 5 minutes later, one of the guys from our group came into our room. He saw the back door, and as a joke, he went over and threw it wide open, proving that it was not sealed at all. We quickly locked it and tried to forget about it. Later that night, after the festival, we got back to the motel late. As we were walking from our van to our rooms, we noticed a group of men sitting outside one of the other rooms, drinking beer. They were loud and very obviously drunk. As we walked by, they started catcalling us and making crude comments. It was unsettling, but we just ignored them and hurried into our room. I made sure to slam the door, lock the deadbolt, and slide the chain lock into place. The other girls in my room were younger and a bit naive. A couple of them thought it was fine to just open the door anytime someone knocked, without checking who it was first. I had to explain to them that you should always look through the peephole before opening a door for anyone, especially in a place like this. It is just common sense for safety. Late that night, I was woken up by a strange, quiet sound. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping. I sat up in bed and listened, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Then I realized someone was knocking on our front door. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, careful not to wake the other girls. I tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole, thinking it might be one of the chaperones checking on us. But as soon as my eye got to the peephole, a hand came up from the side and covered it completely. My heart started racing. Through the tiny sliver of a view I had before the hand covered it, I saw two of the drunk men who had been sitting outside earlier. I backed away from the door slowly, my mind reeling with fear. I tried to stay calm and quiet. The knocking continued, a little louder this time. As I was backing away, I saw a shadow move outside the blurry, tinted window of the back door. I could just make out the silhouette of a person standing right outside the other entrance to our room. They had us surrounded. One of the other girls in the room woke up from the knocking. She looked at me, confused. I quickly typed out a message on my phone and showed it to her, explaining what was happening. We both laid there in our beds, terrified, watching the shadow move back and forth outside the back window and listening to the intermittent knocking on the front door. We were too scared to bang on the wall to alert the chaperones, worried it would make the men angry or cause them to try and break in. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped and the shadow disappeared. We both managed to fall back asleep at some point, out of sheer exhaustion and fear. The next morning, when I opened the front door to leave, I found a small, folded piece of paper on the ground. I picked it up and opened it. In shaky, messy handwriting, it just said, "You're pretty." I was so disgusted and creeped out that I immediately ripped the note into tiny pieces and flushed it down the toilet so no one else would see it. Looking back now, I know I was young and stupid. I should have woken up a chaperone immediately. It could have turned into a very dangerous situation. I am so grateful that I was the one who woke up that night, and not one of the younger girls who might have opened the door. And I am grateful that I am obsessive about triple-checking that doors are locked. That night gave me a permanent fear of roadside motels, and a chilling reminder of how vulnerable you can be. A few years back, my brother and I took our kids camping for a long weekend. It was just him and his young son, and me and my 7-year-old daughter Lily. We went to a national forest campground that was usually pretty busy, but we decided to stay an extra night after the holiday weekend was over. By that last night, the entire campground had cleared out, and it was just our 2 tents in the whole place. It was a little eerie being so alone out there, but also peaceful. Around 3 in the morning, I was woken up by Lily shaking my arm. She whispered that she had to go to the bathroom and that it was an emergency. This meant there was no getting her to just squat outside the tent. We had to make the trek to the outhouse. The outhouse was about 100 yards away from our campsite, a walk that felt much longer in the pitch-black darkness of the woods. Our campfire had long since died out, and there was no moonlight to speak of. I grabbed a flashlight, and we both put on our shoes and headed out. I stood outside the creepy wooden outhouse while she did her business, shining the flashlight beam around the dark woods. I would be lying if I said I was not a little scared. Being out there in the total darkness, miles from anywhere, with just my young daughter, made me feel incredibly vulnerable. Luckily, she was quick, and we started the walk back to our tent. The only light was the small circle from my flashlight cutting through the blackness. The walk back was quiet at first. We were just chatting about silly things to keep our minds off the darkness. Lily was getting a little scared, realizing just how alone we were in the huge empty campground. We were about 50 feet away from our tent, almost back to the perceived safety of our sleeping bags, when Lily suddenly squeezed my hand tightly and stopped walking. She whispered, her voice trembling, "Daddy, who is that?" I looked around, confused. "Who's what, sweetie? I do not see anyone." I swept the flashlight beam through the trees, but there was nothing there but darkness. "That man," she insisted, pointing into the woods just off the path. "Right there. Who is that?" I shined the light exactly where she was pointing. There was nothing there, just a couple of pine trees and some bushes. But the fear in her voice was real. I grabbed her hand even tighter and picked up the pace, practically dragging her the rest of the way back to our tent. My heart was pounding. I knew that if there really was someone out there, some creepy person messing with us in the middle of the night, we were in serious trouble. We scrambled back into the tent, and I zipped it up as fast as I could. We got back into our sleeping bags, and I just laid there, listening. Every sound from outside the tent, every twig snap, every rustle of leaves, which I had not even noticed before, now sounded like a threat. My mind was racing, imagining who could be out there. Lily started to drift off to sleep, but before she did, she asked if we were going to be okay. I told her yes, of course we were. Even though I was absolutely terrified myself, I asked her, in a quiet voice, what the man she saw had looked like. She said, "He looked like an old Indian chief." Then she fell asleep. I laid awake for what seemed like hours, my ears straining to hear any sound of movement outside. I could not take the fear and uncertainty anymore. I finally woke up my brother in the other tent and told him what had happened. He is much more comfortable and experienced in the woods than I am. He got up without a word, grabbed his hatchet, and got the fire going again. We sat by the fire, staying vigilant until the sun came up. Nothing else happened. The next morning, as we were packing up, I asked Lily about the man she had seen the night before. She just looked at me with a confused expression and said she did not know what I was talking about. She had no memory of it at all. To this day, she still does not remember anything about that night. The area we were camping in is well known for its Native American history. It was a place where tribes had lived for centuries before they were forced out. My brother and I searched the area around our campsite that morning, but we did not find any footprints or any sign that anyone had been there. My logical explanation is that she was half asleep and had a vivid dream or a hallucination. But the absolute terror in her voice when she grabbed my hand that night felt so real. I will never know for sure what she saw or what she thought she saw, but the memory of that moment in the dark woods still gives me chills. It was last summer, July of 2023, when my family and I went on our annual camping trip. We always go to the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York, usually finding a nice secluded spot near one of the smaller lakes. This time we were camped near Mirror Lake. I was 19 at the time, and I had recently gotten into nature photography. I had a decent DSLR camera and spent most of my free time trying to capture interesting shots of the wilderness. On our second day there, I was exploring a trail not far from our campsite when I saw something incredibly strange. It was a massive, ancient white pine tree, probably hundreds of years old, but one entire side of it was stripped completely bare of branches and bark. It looked like a giant beast had raked its claws down the trunk, leaving smooth, pale wood exposed. It was both beautiful and unsettling, and I knew I had to get a picture of it. The tree was just a little ways down a smaller, less traveled path that branched off from the main trail. I told my dad I was just going to be a few minutes and headed off. I followed the narrow path, my eyes fixed on the giant pine. It was only about 100 yards away. I found the perfect angle, where the afternoon sun highlighted the strange, scarred wood against the dark green of the surrounding forest. I spent maybe 5 or 10 minutes taking pictures, completely absorbed in what I was doing. When I was satisfied, I packed up my camera and turned to head back to the main trail. The walk back should have taken me 2 minutes at most, but when I got to where the main trail should have been, it was gone. There was only more dense forest. I figured I must have gotten turned around, so I walked back towards the giant pine tree to get my bearings. But the pine tree was gone too. I stood in a small clearing that looked vaguely familiar, but also completely wrong. I was still on a path, so I knew I wasn't totally lost. I decided to just follow it, assuming it would eventually loop back to the main trail. I walked in one direction for about 10 minutes, but the scenery didn't change. I passed the same oddly shaped boulder 3 separate times. A feeling of unease started to creep into my gut. This was a well-marked state park. The trails were supposed to be easy to follow. I decided to turn around and walk in the opposite direction. I was sure I would find our campsite if I just kept going. But after another 10 minutes of walking, I was still surrounded by unfamiliar trees. I couldn't find the main trail, I couldn't find the giant pine, and I couldn't find our camp. The path I was on seemed to go on forever, yet it also seemed to be leading me in circles. Panic started to set in. I started calling out for my dad, shouting his name as loudly as I could. My voice just seemed to get swallowed by the trees. There was no echo, no reply, nothing. I did this for a while, walking back and forth on this endless, looping trail, yelling until my throat was raw. I was getting desperate. I tried to use the sun to navigate, but it seemed to be in the wrong part of the sky for the time of day. It felt like I was walking through some kind of invisible maze, where every turn just took me back to where I started. After what felt like an hour of this frustrating and terrifying experience, I stopped to catch my breath, and that is when I noticed the silence. It was not the normal quiet of the woods. It was a deep, oppressive silence, like the entire world was holding its breath. The birds had stopped singing, the squirrels had stopped chattering, and even the sound of the wind in the trees had disappeared. It felt like I was wearing noise-cancelling headphones, and the silence was so profound, it was making my ears ring. It was unnatural and deeply unsettling. Then, through the muffled silence, I heard a new sound. It was the sound of the ocean. It was not a gentle lapping of waves. It was the thunderous crash of huge, powerful waves hitting a rocky shore. The sound was so clear and so real that I could almost smell the salt in the air. But I was in the middle of the Adirondack Mountains, hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if it was being broadcast directly into my brain. That was when the real panic hit me. This was not normal. Something was very, very wrong. I did not think anymore. I just ran. I picked a direction and bolted through the trees, not caring about the trail anymore. I scrambled over fallen logs and pushed through thick underbrush, with branches scratching at my face and arms. I just needed to get away from that impossible sound and that suffocating silence. I ran until my lungs felt like they were on fire and my legs were about to give out. Then, I tripped on a root and went sprawling to the ground. When I looked up, I was back on the main trail, not 20 yards from our campsite. The normal sounds of the forest rushed back in all at once. The birds, the wind, the distant laughter of other campers. The impossible silence and the sound of the ocean were gone, as if they had never been there. The whole ordeal felt like it had lasted maybe 45 minutes at the most. I staggered back into our camp, exhausted and confused. My dad rushed over to me, his face a mixture of relief and anger. He told me I had been gone for over 3 hours. He and one of the park rangers had been searching for me, shouting my name. He said they followed my footprints down the small path, but then my tracks just stopped in the middle of the trail, as if I had vanished into thin air. I tried to explain what happened, about the looping trail and the silence and the ocean sounds, but he just thought I was dehydrated and disoriented from being lost. I never found that strange, scarred pine tree again. I do not know what happened to me in the woods that day, but I know that I lost 3 hours of my life, and I found something out there that should not exist. When I was studying abroad in Manchester, England, my flat was on the edge of a neighbourhood that was a strange mix of student housing and old working-class terraced homes. The streets were narrow, the air was perpetually damp, and at night, a thick fog would often roll in, muffling sound and turning the familiar streetlights into hazy, indistinct glows. It was on one of these foggy nights, New Year's Eve of 2019, that our ordeal began. There were 4 of us in the flat, all American girls, and we had decided to go out to a pub crawl to celebrate. We got dressed up, drank cheap Prosecco in our kitchen, and headed out into the night. We were all pretty drunk by the time we started the walk home around 2 a.m. One of my flatmates, Sarah, was a happy, giggling mess, and another, Emily, was stumbling and declaring her undying love for all of us. My friend Chloe and I were a bit more coherent, but still noticeably drunk. Our route home took us down a long, straight road called Ashton Street. As we walked, we passed the dark opening of a narrow back alley, what the locals called a ginnel. Standing about 30 yards down the alley, shrouded in the fog, was the silhouette of a man. He was just standing there, perfectly still, right in the middle of the lane. He wasn't on his phone, he wasn't smoking, he was just waiting. The sight of him sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Chloe saw him too, and I saw her tense up beside me. Before we could hurry past, Emily, in her drunken cheerfulness, yelled out, "Happy New Year!" at the top of her lungs and gave the man an enthusiastic wave. Chloe and I grabbed her arms and practically dragged her away from the alley, marching her quickly down the street. A moment later, Chloe whispered, "Is he following us?" My heart leapt into my throat. I risked a quick glance over my shoulder. The man had emerged from the alley and was now walking behind us. He wasn't rushing, just keeping a steady pace on the opposite side of the street, a dark shape moving through the fog. We sped up, our drunken stumbling turning into a purposeful, frightened stride. We were faced with a terrible choice. Our flat was just ahead, one of a long row of identical terraced houses. If we went straight there, he would know exactly which door was ours. We couldn't risk it. At the end of the street was a 24-hour kebab shop, its bright, greasy lights cutting through the fog. "In here," I said, and we all ducked inside. The shop was empty except for the guy behind the counter. We pretended to look at the menu, our backs to the large front window. I snuck a peek at our reflection in the glass. The man had stopped across the street. He was standing under a streetlight, looking directly at the shop, directly at us. He made no move to cross, no move to leave. He just stood there, watching. We stayed in that kebab shop for almost an hour, pretending to be indecisive, until he finally turned and walked away, disappearing back into the fog. We took a long, roundabout way home after that. Life went on, and the memory of the man in the alley faded into just another drunken New Year's story. 2 years later, I had graduated and moved back to the same area of Manchester for a job. I was living alone in a small flat, just a few streets away from my old one. I had completely forgotten about that night. My job was at a restaurant, and I often worked the late shift, not getting home until after midnight. My walk home took me down the lower end of that same road, Ashton Street. For 2 Saturdays in a row, I had the distinct feeling I was being followed. Both times, I managed to shake the feeling, once by ducking into a late-night convenience store, and another time by calling a friend who lived nearby to come out and chat with me until the person behind me had passed. I chalked it up to big city paranoia. Then came a Friday night in November. I left work around 1:30 a.m. I was exhausted, my mind on getting home to bed. I wasn't paying much attention to my surroundings when a man crossed the street from the other side, walking directly towards me. I was immediately on high alert. He got closer and asked if I had a light. "Sorry, I don't smoke," I said, not breaking my stride. He kept walking past me in the opposite direction, and I felt a small wave of relief. But then I heard his footsteps stop. I heard them turn. And then I heard them falling into step right behind mine. He was following me. My blood ran cold. He had a slight but distinctive limp, a detail that tickled at the edge of my memory. We were walking along the main road, which still had a few cars passing by. But my turn was coming up, a turn that would lead me into a much quieter, darker residential area. I decided to test him. I took my turn, and so did he. My brain, in a flash of terror, finally made the connection. The limp, the way he just stood and watched. It was him, the man from the alley 2 years ago. I didn't know what to do. My flat was still a few blocks away. I couldn't lead him there. My mind raced, searching for an escape. Then I remembered. The local police station was just 2 blocks in the other direction. It was my only chance. I abruptly turned around, forcing him to stop to avoid running into me. I didn't say a word, just started walking quickly back the way I came. He seemed momentarily confused, then he too turned and started following me again. When I reached the corner where the police station was, I broke into a full sprint. I ran up the steps to the front door and threw my weight against it, only to find it locked. A sign said the front desk was closed to the public after 10 p.m. and to use the emergency phone on the wall for assistance. My heart sank. I looked back at the street. He had stopped at the corner under a streetlight, just watching me. He wasn't running. He was just standing there, as if he knew he had all the time in the world. My hands shaking, I picked up the emergency phone. As I was trying to explain the situation to the dispatcher, I watched him. He stood there for a few more seconds, then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, turned, and calmly walked away, his limping gait carrying him back into the darkness. A police car arrived a few minutes later, but he was long gone. I've never felt so hunted in my entire life. I moved out of that neighborhood the next month. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know he remembered me, and he had been waiting. I live in a fairly large city in Eastern Europe, but my family's apartment is in what people consider a rough neighborhood. Honestly, I have never had any real trouble here. You see the occasional graffiti or kids causing minor trouble, but I have never encountered anyone genuinely dangerous. I am still in my late teens and live with my parents and older brother. Growing up here, you learn to be aware of your surroundings and to be a little bit street smart. This happened a couple of years ago, on New Year's Day. Everyone was still recovering from the celebrations the night before. Around 3 in the afternoon, my dad left to go play table tennis with his friends, and I knew he would not be back until late in the evening. A little while later, my mum and brother left to go help a family friend clean up after their big New Year's party. I was supposed to go with them, but I was feeling pretty sick and hungover, so I stayed home. In hindsight, being sick was probably the luckiest thing that could have happened to me. So, I was home alone, which was not unusual and did not bother me at all. I spent the next few hours just lounging around, watching TV shows on my laptop. Around 6 o'clock, I got a sudden craving for snacks. There is a big supermarket right behind our apartment building that is usually open late, so it is my go-to place for junk food. It is only a 5-minute walk away. I pulled on a coat over my pajamas, slipped on some sandals, and headed out. It was freezing cold outside, and the sun had already set. I could see the bright, welcoming lights of the supermarket in the distance. But as I got closer, I noticed something odd. There was a man standing right in front of the automatic doors, just standing there, motionless. He was a short, stocky man, and as I got closer, I recognized his face. I had seen him many times before, just wandering around our neighborhood. He always looked a bit disheveled, and I had always just assumed he was homeless. I never thought much of him. He was poorly dressed and was standing there as if he were a security guard. I walked up and asked him if the supermarket was still open. He did not say anything. He just pointed to a small, handwritten sign taped to the glass door. It said that because of the holiday, the store had closed at 6 p.m. I checked my phone. It was 6:20. I let out a disappointed sigh and started to turn around to go home. But then the man spoke to me in a strange, urgent voice. He told me that there was a small, 24-hour convenience store just a little further down the street. I told him it was fine and that I would just come back tomorrow, but he kept insisting. He said it was only a 2-minute walk from there and that I should go. The way he was staring at me while he said this was really weird and intense. It was the first major red flag. In my head, I tried to rationalize his behavior. Maybe he was just trying to be helpful, hoping I would give him some money for the tip. It sort of made sense, but I was still on high alert. I decided to just go to the other store to get him to leave me alone. I walked to the convenience store, quickly grabbed some chips and a soda, and left in a hurry. The whole time, I had a growing sense of nervousness. My gut was telling me that something was wrong. What really set my internal alarms ringing was when I walked past the supermarket again on my way home. The man who had been standing there was gone. I had only been away for about 5 minutes. At that point, a jolt of adrenaline hit me, and I started jogging back toward my apartment building. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, but the feeling of dread was overwhelming. I got to the front of my building, and as I was fumbling for my keys, I saw a tall, dark figure in the distance enter the lobby and get into the elevator. At the exact same moment, the automatic motion sensor lights in the lobby switched off, plunging the entrance into darkness. I ran to the intercom door, clumsily unlocked it, and rushed inside. The elevator was already moving. I live on the 7th floor, and I watched the numbers light up as the elevator ascended. When it stopped on the 5th floor, I let out a sigh of relief. It was probably just one of my neighbors. Still feeling skeptical, I decided to take the stairs, just to be safe. As I was walking up, almost laughing at my own paranoia, I noticed that the light on the landing of the 6th floor was on. That was a little strange, since the lights were on a timer and should have turned off. I kept going, and then I saw that the light on my floor, the 7th floor, was also on. I stopped on the stairs between the 6th and 7th floors and waited, my heart pounding. I hoped that whoever it was would continue up to the 8th floor. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but the light on my floor stayed on. The elevator did not move. I knew something was wrong. I decided I had to do something. I took a deep breath and ran the rest of the way up the stairs. When I got to my floor and looked down the hallway, I saw something that almost made my heart stop. The tall, dark figure I had seen in the lobby was kneeling in front of my apartment door. He was hunched over the doorknob, and it looked like he was trying to pick the lock. In situations like this, I do not get angry. I just get scared. I wanted it to stop. From the end of the hallway, I let out a weak, shaky, "Hey!" The man instantly snapped his head around and stood up. I saw his face for a split second. He was wearing a long black trench coat and leather gloves, and he looked terrified that he had been caught. But then he did the most unsettling thing possible. He smiled at me, a wide, unnatural grin that revealed a set of yellow, crooked teeth. Do you know how sickening that feels? To find someone trying to break into your home, and they just smile at you. The fear I was feeling multiplied by 10. I was completely frozen. To my surprise, instead of coming toward me, the man turned and ran in the opposite direction, toward the other stairwell. Just before he disappeared down the stairs, he mumbled the word, "sorry," and was gone. I stood there in shock, unable to move or even breathe properly. I eventually managed to get inside my apartment and saw that a small metal pin was still stuck in the lock. He was definitely trying to get in. Looking back, I am convinced that the man at the supermarket and the tall man were working together. The first man's job was to delay me, to make sure I was out of my apartment long enough for the second man to get inside. Who knows what they wanted to do? My family would not be back for hours. It is a terrifying thought. One thing is for sure, I keep a baseball bat next to my bed now. When I was in college, I made the decision to transfer from my school on the West Coast to a small university in Missouri. It was a big change, and in my second year there, I started dating a guy named Kevin. He was about 10 years older than me and was in the police academy at the time. When he graduated, he got a job as a corrections officer at a nearby state prison. Looking back now, there were so many red flags early on in our relationship that I chose to ignore. For example, I found out that he had gotten a 16-year-old girl pregnant the year before we met, and he had a young son that he refused to ever let me meet. Another huge red flag was his jealousy. He would get incredibly aggressive and start fights at bars if he saw me even talking to another guy. Before I flew home to California for Thanksgiving break, Kevin surprised me with a gift, a golden retriever puppy. I named her Roxy. He insisted on keeping the puppy at his place while I was gone for the week. While I was home, my parents and I talked, and we all decided that it would be best for me to move back to California and finish my degree there. The small-town Midwest culture just was not for me. I was there for an education, but it seemed like most of the girls in my sorority were just there to find a husband. When I called Kevin and told him my decision, that I would be moving back home at the end of the semester, he absolutely lost his mind. He went ballistic. He would call me non-stop, screaming at me one minute, crying the next, and then making threats. The one threat that terrified me the most was when he told me that if I left him, he would kill the puppy. When I got back to Missouri after the break, I immediately asked him where Roxy was. He told me, with a straight face, that she had gotten sick while I was gone and had died. I was heartbroken. A few days later, we were at his parents' house, and his mom pulled me aside into another room. She looked me in the eyes and told me the truth. She said that after our phone call on Thanksgiving, Kevin had taken the puppy out into the driveway and had deliberately run her over with his truck. He had murdered my dog because he was angry with me. That was the moment I knew I was dealing with someone truly dangerous, and I became terrified of him. A few weeks later, after I had finished my final exams, my mum flew out to help me pack up my belongings to be shipped back home. On my last night in town, Kevin came by my hotel to say goodbye. He'd been trying everything to get me to stay. He even proposed to me with a cheap, ugly diamond ring that looked like it came from a gumball machine. I rejected him, and he threw the ring into the back seat of his truck, saying it was not for me anyway. I tried to be firm, but calm. I told him we could try a long-distance relationship, but that I was moving home and my decision was final. That is when he snapped. He reached over, locked the doors of his truck, grabbed my purse from my lap, and threw it onto the floor on the driver's side. Then he started the engine and drove off, with me trapped in the passenger seat. His home was a trailer in a small, isolated town, about a 2-hour drive from my hotel. I pleaded with him. I begged him. I cried. But he would not listen. My phone, which was in my purse, started ringing over and over. It was my mom, worried about where I was. I told him she would call the police. He just laughed and said, "She does not have my license plate number. She does not know where I live. And besides, I am a cop." When we got to his trailer, he took my purse and locked it in his gun safe. The rest of that night was a nightmare that I have tried my best to block from my memory. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. He made me breakfast and told me he had to go to work. I asked him when I could call my mum. I even tried to play his game, pretending that I had changed my mind and that I needed to call her to tell her the good news that I was staying with him. He just gave me a creepy, smug smile and said we would discuss it later, but that I was not going anywhere. As soon as he left for work, I tried the front door. It was locked from the outside with a heavy-duty padlock. He had done the same thing to the back door. I was trapped. His property was in the middle of nowhere, with his aunt's trailer being the only other home for miles. In a panic, I looked around the kitchen and found a heavy frying pan. I used it to smash one of the kitchen windows, cutting my arm in the process. I climbed out and ran to his aunt's trailer, pounding on her door. I barely knew her, but I pushed my way inside and told her it was an emergency and I needed to use her phone. I did not know my mum's cell number by heart, so I called my dad at home in California. Instead of being concerned, my parents were angry. They yelled at me for disappearing and making my mum worry that I was going to miss my flight. They did not seem to understand the gravity of the situation I was in. I was too scared to explain everything, terrified that Kevin would come back early. I asked his aunt to call his mother. His mother finally arrived a couple of hours later. She had my purse with her. I did not ask how she got it. She drove me the 2 hours back to my hotel. The entire car ride was surreal. She did not say much, but when she did, it was to tell me that her son was a special, sweet boy who just had to have whatever pretty thing he set his eyes on. I got back to the hotel, grabbed my things, and my mum and I went straight to the airport. I was out of that state as fast as I could be. When I got home, I filed for a restraining order. For months, he called our house phone non-stop. He somehow found out from a Facebook post that my new boyfriend and I were going to Disneyland. He flew to California and waited outside the park entrance for days, asking Disney employees if they had seen me. Luckily, we had changed our plans at the last minute. The thought of what could have happened if he had found me still scares me. I was lucky I escaped. I work as a park operator for the provincial parks in British Columbia. My job involves a lot of different things, from maintenance to visitor services. But during the busy summer season, I often have to work the night shift. This shift mostly consists of doing security patrols through the campground and collecting fees from late arrivals. One night a couple of summers ago, I was working a late shift at one of our more remote parks. It was a very dark night, with a thick layer of clouds blocking out the moon and stars. My shift was almost over, and I was parked in my work truck at the bottom of the main road that led down into the campground. I had my windows rolled down, enjoying the cool night air and scrolling through my phone, just waiting for it to be time to lock the main gate and go home. Suddenly, I heard a noise coming from outside my passenger side window. It was the distinct sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel and dry leaves. At first, I was not too alarmed. We have a lot of wildlife in the park, including black bears, and it is common to hear them moving around at night. I just sat there and listened as whatever it was walked around near my truck. The footsteps were light, almost cautious. Then, the sound changed. The footsteps started to pick up pace, and they were heading directly for my truck. It sounded like something was running straight at me out of the pitch-black darkness. I braced myself, my hands gripping the steering wheel, fully expecting a deer or even a bear to crash into the side of my truck. I could hear it getting closer and closer, but just as it sounded like it was about to make contact with my passenger door, the sound just stopped. Complete silence. There was no impact, no sound of it running away, just nothing. It was as if whatever was running had simply vanished into thin air a foot away from my vehicle. My heart was pounding. I did not wait to investigate. I slammed the truck into drive and sped up the road to the main cabin and workshop area, away from whatever was messing with me in the dark. I was already completely on edge, and my only thought was to lock the main gate and get the hell out of there. But before I could leave in my personal car, I had to put the parked truck keys away in the workshop. The workshop is located inside a fenced-off compound, which of course is completely unlit at night. I grabbed my cell phone, turned on its flashlight, and started walking toward the compound gate. The crappy little LED light on my phone did not do much to cut through the oppressive darkness. Every little sound, every leaf crunching under my feet, made me jump. My nerves were shot. I walked through the gate into the compound. As I was walking past the area where we store our maintenance vehicles and golf carts, I heard a sudden, loud, high-pitched screeching sound like a piercing alarm. My body went into full fight-or-flight mode. I spun around, my fists up, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. The sound continued, a constant, grating beep. I recognized it as the reverse alarm on one of our electric golf carts. But the cart had been parked there all day. Someone or something would have had to physically get into the cart and flip the switch from forward to reverse to make that sound start. My mind started racing. Who or what turned that on? Was this some kind of trap? I crept slowly toward the golf cart, scanning the darkness around me with my phone's weak flashlight, scared out of my mind. I half expected someone to jump out at me from behind one of the other vehicles. I finally got to the cart and quickly reached in and flipped the reverse lever back to neutral, silencing the horrible noise. Nothing happened. No one was there. I did not stick around to ponder the mystery. I practically threw the parked truck keys into the workshop, ran back to my car and locked the doors. I turned on every single light my car had, the headlights, the high beams, and even my emergency flashers. I unlocked the main gate faster than I ever have before, and before I drove away, I even did a pathetic, paranoid check of my back seat to make sure no one was hiding there. I still do not know what happened that night. I cannot explain the footsteps that ran at my truck and then disappeared, or how the golf cart's reverse alarm turned on by itself. Working in the parks is a great job during the day, but the night shift in the middle of the woods can be genuinely terrifying. My best friend, Leo, and I have had a standing tradition since high school. 1 week every summer, we disappear. We pick a remote spot on a map, usually somewhere in the deep woods of Minnesota or Wisconsin, and go completely off the grid. No phones, no internet, just fishing, campfires, and the kind of easy silence that only comes with years of friendship. Last summer, we chose a spot near the Boundary Waters, a small, unnamed lake accessible only by a long, rutted-out dirt road. The isolation was the whole point. The moment we pulled up to the clearing that served as a campsite, something felt off. The air was still and heavy, and the woods were unusually quiet. There were no birds chirping, no squirrels chattering, just a profound, listening silence. In the center of the clearing was a fire pit, and the ashes inside were still warm. Someone had been here very recently. We scanned the area but saw no one, no car, no tent. It was unsettling, but we figured they must have just been passing through. We decided to set up camp anyway, pushing the strange feeling to the back of our minds. We spent the afternoon fishing from our canoe. The lake was like glass, and we didn't see another soul. As dusk began to settle, the quiet of the woods started to feel less peaceful and more oppressive. Every snapped twig or rustle of leaves sounded magnified, and we both found ourselves constantly glancing over our shoulders into the dark wall of trees surrounding our camp. We built a big fire, as if the light could ward off the growing unease. We didn't talk about it directly, but I could tell Leo felt it too. He was jumpy, and his usual easygoing demeanor was gone, replaced by a tense watchfulness. We turned in early, zipping ourselves into our two-man tent. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the crackle of the dying fire and the strange, deep silence of the forest. Eventually, I must have drifted off. I woke up to the first pale light of dawn filtering through the thin fabric of the tent. Leo was already sitting up, staring at the zipped-up tent door with a strange expression on his face. "What's wrong?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away. He just pointed towards the door. "Something's out there." I slowly sat up, my heart starting to pound. I couldn't hear anything. "What do you mean?" "Just look," he said, his voice barely audible. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the zipper on the tent flap. I pulled it down just a few inches, creating a small slit to peer through. I looked out at our campsite. Fire was dead, a pile of grey ash. Our gear was just as we'd left it. Everything looked normal, except for one thing. Sitting on the large flat log we had used as a bench in front of our fire pit was a single child sneaker. It was a small, white sneaker with bright pink laces, the kind a little girl might wear. It was placed perfectly in the center of the log, upright and facing our tent. It was clean, almost pristine, as if it had been taken right out of a box. It hadn't been there when we went to bed. I knew that, with absolute certainty. We would have seen it. A wave of cold dread washed over me. This wasn't a prank. This was a message. But what did it mean? Where was the other sneaker? And more importantly, where was the child it belonged to? The silence of the woods suddenly seemed sinister, filled with unspoken threats. Someone had been in our camp while we slept. They had walked right up to our tent, close enough to place that shoe on the log, and we hadn't heard a thing. Leo and I looked at each other, the same terror reflected in our eyes. We didn't need to discuss it. There was no rational explanation that felt safe. We moved with a silent, frantic urgency. We didn't bother packing neatly. We just shoved everything into our bags and into the back of the truck. The whole time, I couldn't take my eyes off that little white sneaker. It sat there on the log, a tiny, innocent object that felt like the most menacing thing I had ever seen. We left it there. We didn't touch it. It felt wrong, like disturbing evidence at a crime scene. We got in the truck, locked the doors, and tore down that dirt road, kicking up a massive cloud of dust behind us. We didn't slow down until we hit paved asphalt. We drove for an hour in complete silence before Leo finally spoke. "What do you think that was?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," I said, "and I don't want to know." We called the county sheriff's office from the first town we came to. We told them what we found, about the warm campfire and the little sneaker. The dispatcher sounded bored, but she took our information and said they would send a deputy to check it out. We never heard anything back. We cut our trip short and drove home that day. We didn't talk about what happened, but it hung between us. The woods had always been our escape, our sanctuary. But that morning they had shown us a different side, a darker side. and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that we had made the right decision to leave.